Hey everyone, it's Andrea. This is a conversation I just had with Bernardo Kastrup. I'm actually posting our first conversation later this week and I already had it ready to post. And then I was just writing with him about that and some other things. And we decided to just jump on and have a talk about everything that's happening in the world as I just got back from the United States and from voting. I'm just going to post our conversation just raw as it is. I'm still trying to understand everything that's happened. And maybe you are too, and maybe it helps to just hear us talk about it off the cuff without any kind of notes or, or whatever. We just had a few things we thought we'd talk about, and we talked about them. That was what we did today. It was all very impromptu. And I really appreciate Bernardo. He hung out for 3.5 hours to talk about this stuff, even though I think it was his back was hurting and who knows what else. So we both hung out a while to talk about it because it feels important to just talk and try to understand what's going on and how we feel about it. And I send you all a lot of love, no matter where you are or what side you're on or what's going on. I hope we all find good ways together, honest ways, authentic ways, motivating ways, exciting ways. So here it is. Here's Bernardo and I talking and talking. All right. I think it's all good. Okay. So I already asked you how you are in the aftermath of all that is going on in the world now. But yeah, how are you, Bernardo?
Given the circumstances and the times we live in, I'm doing all right. My little microcosm here in my family, my friends, my life is doing okay. Of course, I am worried about the world.
Yeah. Were you shocked by what happened in the US recently on November
Shocked?
5th?
No, I think for those paying attention, the writing was on the wall. I had a hope that things would go in a different way. Not that I was cheering and supporting the other side. I think unfortunately, Americans found themselves in a situation where you had to choose the lesser of two evils. But
Evil is a
yeah,
strong word. Do you really mean that? Or is it
no,
just the
I
phrase?
just use the word because it's part of a normal expression
Yeah.
that we. And I don't mean that.
Yeah.
Evil, true evil, insinuates itself in a way that most people would never use the word evil for when it's beginning to insinuate itself. That's what we've seen historically. True evil when it begins doesn't look like evil. It looks even reasonable. So maybe the word is applicable here, but it's not the reason I used it. I used the word simply because it's a normal expression used in daily life.
Yeah, but it gets used a lot, and I guess it also gets to this dichotomy thing that interests me a lot based on these themes too. But and I do wonder about your views on that because I think it relates to everything that's going on now. Do you believe there's this good and evil in a really absolute sense?
There are these things that happen in the world that we call evil, right? That's an empirical fact. Is the word evil the appropriate one? We can have a discussion on that. What do we mean by evil? Do we mean fundamental evil, or do we mean something that because of ignorance ends up doing harm but is not fundamentally evil? So those discussions we can have. But in colloquial language, this stuff we refer to generally as evil, that stuff happens. Look at Europe right now. Great evil is being done. Completely innocent people are being killed for absolutely no good reason other than to push the geopolitical, mystical hallucinations of a dictator. If the word evil is not appropriate for that, no, what is it appropriate for? So evil does happen, and it insinuates itself very seductively in the beginning.
How do we deal with the fact that from different positions the word is defined differently, though? Because even the situation that you just brought up, from the position that you and I are in, I know exactly what you mean and would agree with you. But if I were in the position of the people doing that, for example, I don't think they would agree with that. And they might even have very legitimate, from their point of view and their development, reasons to say maybe that where we sit right now or someone else is evil. So that's a very confusing and hard thing to deal with and talk about. How do you think about that?
I think it's very dangerous that we find ourselves in relativistic moral morass. in which we
Yeah.
say that good and evil are relative and there is no truth, it's all about points of view. I don't think that is valid. I think there is a reality to human suffering that when it is imposed on someone unfairly, it should be called evil. And that's an absolute thing. It's not a matter of point of view. We have all experienced injustice. So we all know what I mean by that. The problem is that since we are conceptually thinking monkeys, we tend to replace the rawness and of certain absolute reality with internal narratives, and we lose sight of the direct acquaintance with the reality of an evil deed. We replace that direct experience with conceptual frameworks and narratives that sort of muddle the waters, makes everything unclear. And we think that's the reality then, that lack of clarity belongs in the world instead of just in our own minds, our own narrative making about the world. Once we slide down that slippery slope, we get into an abyss in which there are no clear moral guardrails. You can justify anything by telling yourself an appropriate story about it. So I'm sure that Putin doesn't see himself as evil. He thinks that he is ensuring the future safety and prosperity of the Slavic peoples, and that the price to pay for that, even though it may be very high in terms of the direct suffering and murder and torture of the Slavic peoples today, they may calculate that in his fantasized conceptual hallucination, that is a worth price to pay for future generations. Of course, that's a delusion. Putin is engaged in mystical thinking here. He thinks that there is such an entity as Russia and the Slavic peoples that is above the actual lived reality of the Russian and the Slavic peoples today. And then there is no such other mystical entity,
Hmm.
such an abstraction that makes it worth to pay a horrible price in the concrete real life today. It's not there, but one can delude himself or herself to think along these lines. Hitler thought he was bringing the German peoples out of misery.
It's not that I don't agree with you on these things, but I find that it's very hard to nail it down. Do we just end up saying, okay, we just all fight for our position, and in the end, it all comes out? In the case of Hitler, for example, like over time, it becomes clear to most people what that really was, right? And so we could maybe think that what's going on in the world today, over time, it's going to become clear because it is evil and there is this kind of, these regularities show themselves with time. But you brought up narrative a lot in there too. And that's a word like with the US election that's been used a lot. And, there's all this kind of everything's about the narrative and how strong your narrative is. And as we know, like you just said, Putin probably believes his narrative. And there's some kind of weird thing that happens. Maybe you could say what you think about this, but as I see it, that people really believe in their narratives and therefore there's a power to that convinces others that they're true. And I'm not sure just relying on this time and that history will tell feels adequate either. It almost feels, yeah, I wonder what you think, because I'm someone who I do believe with time the truth comes out. And I'm not a person who wants fighting. And I would say if you're killing people, it's already on the side that I don't want to be on. But of course, there's exceptions. That sort of narrative too can have its trouble. So I guess I just wonder how you deal with it, because it's a paradox that we have to hold, but I think it's hard to hold. That the more you believe in your narrative, even if it's wrong, the more you're going to convince others it's right often.
Yeah, I agree with you that ultimately the truth comes out. And you might then ask, why don't we learn then historically? It's because our lifetime is so short. We are mayflies. A lot of young people alive today have no relationship with what happened in the 1930s. They never met someone who was alive as an adult in the 19
Yeah.
like I did, because those were my grandparents. They were alive at that time. I heard the stories. Some of the people telling me the stories told me as, okay, look at that. How could you be so foolish? And other people in my youth, the old people of my youth, they had seemingly plausible and reasonable justification for what happened. And into their old age, they thought it was justified what Hitler did, what Mussolini did. So I was exposed to that. I remember real, alive people very close to me in my life who experienced that. But if you talk to an 18-year-old today, it's very abstract. It's something far in the past. And of course, in the absence of of at least an indirect relationship with that, you may have to learn all over again. And some people who maybe did have a relationship with that, maybe they didn't have a close enough relationship. People my age, maybe they didn't have a close enough relationship. Maybe they were far away, they were in another continent, and so they didn't retain the warning, the ability to detect the warning signs. They don't become emotionally alarmed enough when those warning signs repeat themselves, that they can anticipate where things are going, because their original relationship with the historical learning was not close enough. They were not close enough to those experiences. So that happens. But yes, truth will come out, and every 3 generations, we may have to learn it all over again. Now, narratives, I think the greatest danger of our age is the surrender to the pernicious idea that all of reality is just narratives, that there is no such a thing as truth, as facts. This is how people are being manipulated in the early 21st century. In the 19th century, manipulation was done by the creation of an alternative reality. In other words, they would just lie to you. And I'm not talking only about Soviet Russia here. I think it's important that we in the West also recognize that the liberal media has lied and manipulated us for decades. This whole thing started, forgive me for going on a rant now, but this whole thing started because the entire Western world, the Allies, after they beat Germany, they learned from Germany because Germany invented propaganda. And in the West, we realized the power of that, the power to manipulate people and how it could be used for profit. And so the discipline of public relations started. How do you
You're
do
talking
public?
about like Bernays and
Yeah,
Freud and that all that connection of kind of
that came before that, but studying the human psyche to the point that you know how to influence it for manipulative purposes. The Nazis were very good at that. They basically invented propaganda at large scales. That's how they got their peoples to do what they did.
what is that exactly, do you think? Is it knowing more than the people that you're trying to swing one way or the other and using kind of emotional tactics?
Yeah,
Is it
it's
just as
no.
simple as that? Because sometimes I just feel like it's a stance, right? It's, for example, like music. If you hit certain chords, you're going to elicit certain feelings. And yeah, it was just that realization, do you think, that that's possible? And so they had power because the other people hadn't realized that yet? Is that
Even if you realize that this is what's being done to you, it still works. Because
yeah.
we are all human psyches, and the human psyche has the ability to turn in upon itself and study itself. And if you make that your life, your study, you will find out many methods to effectively get us to buy certain products, to want
Mhm.
certain trips, or to vote in a certain way. So
Mhm.
we learned that from the Germans after the war, and that has become public relations, propaganda, marketing, things that we consider acceptable. And the liberal elites have employed that onto their peoples for decades. And it's important to acknowledge that, even if I mean, forget MAGA, that election already has happened. It's water under the bridge. But even if populism in general is something that we do not agree with, we have to acknowledge that the root grievances are valid. And it's not only this, it's not only that we have been manipulated and lied to by liberal media, liberal elites for decades, which we have. It's not as evil as people portray it, but we have. There are other
Yeah.
reasons
It's
also
almost
why.
like a habit that everyone's in, even people who use social media. You assume the stance of that's what you have to do in order to participate in a very there's degrees, of course, but do you know
What you
does
have to
that
do
make
is
sense?
what? To manipulate?
Yeah. But even something like, I don't use social media so much, but I always hear people talking about, like, on Facebook, you basically are putting your what you want other people to think about your life on on there. And that's a very gentle kind of a manipulation, and it even has some effect of helping you feel better about your life, and it's completely understandable and so forth. But I guess what I'm saying is just is infiltrated to such a degree that it's almost like we assume that stance is the only kind of stance you take when you are trying to somehow have some effect or agency over the way people see you.
I,
Mm.
I even don't think that is too dangerous. I think it's psychologically dangerous in the sense that it could lead you to depression unnecessarily. But the, we are narrative making monkeys, and we are not going to be otherwise anytime soon. And it's part of what it means to be a human that we experience reality through the intermediation of narratives that started happening 30 to 50,000 years ago when we started thinking symbolically, when we started replacing direct empirical facts of reality with symbols that represented them, like words, like paintings. When we started replacing reality with our own symbol making, we erected this wall of narratives between us and the absolute facts of reality. So, what we experience is, in fact, how our narratives are modulated by reality, not reality. There is always this layer of narrative making in between. And that's part of what it means to be human. It's not good or bad, it's just the way it is. I think what is incredibly dangerous is when we say there is no reality behind the narratives, there are only the narratives. That's the post truth world. And it's a much more pernicious world because its effect is to reinforce that which it is meant to combat. So what is the original grievance is we have been lied to and manipulated for decades. Is this true? Come on. Who has looked into the facts would deny this? You can have a discussion on to what degree we have been lied to and manipulated, but that we have been lied to and manipulated, it's a fact. And then we upon waking up to that, we become angry and we try to combat that. But in the process of doing it, we have fallen into the trap of not trying to find out what are the true facts, but we've become cynical and now we say, you know what? There are no facts because until today it's all been a lie. My entire lifetime it has all been a lie anyway. And how can we dig the facts? It's impossible to dig the facts. Everything is too complex. So we fall into the trap of saying there are no facts. And that's a reaction to being lied to. The problem is that you just ensured by denying the existence of facts, you ensure that you are much more manipulatable than you were before. Because before, the attempt was to see the facts behind the lies. Now, because you don't believe in facts, you don't even try to do that. So now it's a matter of who can manipulate you more effectively, not who can tell you the truth. Because if someone tells you the truth, you will not recognize it because there is no such a thing as truth. And you will just go for the manipulator that is most capable of grabbing you through the doors of your most basic instincts, your biggest prejudices, the one who mobilizes your primal energies most viciously. That's the one who you will follow because you are no longer even looking for the facts. And if that works, as it's proving to work, it's contagious because even the ones who, in principle, would be willing to tell you the truth, they now realize they will lose if they do that. They realize that's not the game to be played anymore. Now the game is how can I be even more manipulative, more effectively manipulative than the other guy? How do I do that? So
Mm.
what populism is teaching all politicians is that it pays off to lie and manipulate, which is precisely the reinforcement of the very problem that mobilized people to react against the moral elites to begin with. And that, to me, is the greatest catastrophe. It's to see people who have a legitimate grievance um, going about dealing with that grievance in a manner that only reinforces the problem fairly grieve, and which may bring about, and this is not exaggeration or alarmism, but it may bring about the end of human civilization. Because once you lose not only access to truth, but once you lose truth as a value, as something to be desired, as something to be aimed for, if you lose that, if you lose the desire for truth, you can only be manipulated from that point on. You can no longer be treated with respect. You can no longer pass moral judgment on things. Because not only do you not have a relationship with truth, you don't even think you should have. You don't even think it exists. There is no such a thing as truth and facts. The example of the US election, which is water under the bridge, right? We're not trying to resolve anything there because it's resolved. One won, the other one lost. This is it for the next 4 years. But to pick that as a learning example, I heard a lot of people online say, yes, Trump lies, but at least he's an honest liar in the sense he knows everybody knows that he's lying. So now you get the concept of an honest liar. So
Wow.
because he lies so much and all the time, everybody knows that he's lying. So at least we go for the liar that everybody knows is a liar. The moment you slip down into that hole, you become unable to pass value judgments anymore. You cannot pass judgment anymore because you've lost entirely your relationship with fact and truth. So you can't pass any judgment. And in a democracy where every vote counts the same, this is a catastrophe.
Gosh, you touched on so many things that I've been thinking about. First of all, just that there is truth and how hard that is to prove in a weird way. And I almost think of it like a blockchain, right? Like things really are happening and there really are regularities and it really is continuous. So if we could actually trace all of these paths and trajectories of all the decisions we make, there is one way it happened, right? Even though there's many possible ways it could have happened. For me, that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but I do think there's a way in which that holds, even if memory, sometimes we all forget what really happened and so on. There's a kind of intention that actually is blockchain or a path of links that can be followed if only we knew how to do it. And that's in the sense that I think, okay, the truth does eventually come out because it's just there. And all of that's going to eventually resonate. And whether it's like that civilization has to end in the way you just said, or whatever it is, it will all come out. And we do all feel it too. Even there's a kind of, you were talking about the liar that's honest. This is something I would like to dig into, and I don't know how to understand. And that bothers me, not necessarily the results of the election, but that the mood or what has happened in terms of what is acceptable but that isn't acceptable. I don't know. It's all about trying to hold the paradox. But here I'll just give you an example, and then maybe that helps. But with this election, I for example, want to trust and believe in truth and all of this, and you want a party that can tell you that kind of stuff. But then when they're using the same tactics as the party that's lying all the time, even though honestly, it becomes very confusing. For example, I've gotten emails from both sides of the campaign because I like seeing how everyone's talked to. And on the side that's supposed to be honest, right, in the real way, not an honest liar, the tones are just, I can hardly read them because it's always asking me for money or screaming about end of the world is going to happen, so we have to save it. It's like this tone, which is just very much using the tactics of
The other side.
honest liar. But it doesn't work because they're supposed to be the honest. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's something very difficult about it, that one side that's supposed to be honest takes on the tactics of the other, and therefore you do end up feeling as if there's no truth and as if there's no meaning. And
Look, there may be no truth in political discourse today. And going forward, this will be worse because what we have learned over the past 8 years is that lying and manipulating works, and the more crass and obviously you do that with the least subtlety, the more you just try to latch on the most primitive emotional reactions that people have, the more it works.
In the
And
short term.
yeah, learned that over the past 8 to 10 years. We've learned that this works. And politicians do what work because elections are set up as a contest, as a competition to be won or lost. Politicians will try to do what wins. And they are learning now that crass manipulation works better than subtle manipulation, which is what we've had before. So everybody will start doing that because, and they will even morally justify it to themselves by saying, if I don't do that too, the evil guys on the other side will always win. So I owe it to my constituency to do what works in order to save the world. And of course, that's precisely how the world goes to hell when everybody loses their moral grounding for, I would use the word they would use, for pragmatic reasons. I wanted to say something else, but I've lost it now. Look, I think the most important distinction for us to make is that although there may be no truth in political discourse, there is such a thing as truth. Whether it is in political discourse or not, whether it's captured or reflected in political discourse or not, there are facts. And we tend now to think, and this is a propaganda tool. This is what Russian propaganda does, and populism in the West is picking that up directly from Russia and using it in the West. What they try to convince you of is that even if there is such an elusive thing as truth, it is so difficult to access that it might as well not exist. And why do they do that? Why do they want you to believe that? It's because if you lose your relationship with truth, you cannot pass judgment and you become even easier to manipulate than you were before. Because before you were just misinformed. Now you don't even want to be informed. But the fact is that we can access simple, obvious truths. If we don't make it too complicated in our minds, we can access some basic facts that, if we develop a relationship with them, it will make it less likely that we will destroy ourselves. For instance, let's just connect to things that are very accessible and they are important. Number one, there is such a thing as truth. We may not know what it is, but it's there. Number two, we should want to access truth because otherwise we are operating in a fantasy world that somebody else created for us for their benefit and not ours. Right? If we don't want to live in a manufactured world that was invented to benefit somebody else, then we should want to access the truth. That's the second point. The third point is character matters. Decency matters. If you are a conservative like I am, people think I am a liberal in the US sense. I'm a liberal conservative, which in the US is a contradiction, but in the Netherlands, you know that there is no contradiction here at all. It's one of a landscape of 16 major political parties in the Netherlands. If you are a true conservative, like I consider myself to be, then honesty is important. Character is important. Doing the right thing is important. Not lying is important. I only learned that people lie after my father died. I was 12 years old. And then I realized that people lie. And I thought, this is amazing. This is a superpower. People can.
You have to, did they try to convince you it was all okay or something?
Oh no, I just, my father died and suddenly I was more exposed to the world than I was before. And I was growing up and I turned 13, 14 and I realized that people just lie. People just
But how
lie.
did you realize that? You
Because
just,
if people say something and you look at the facts and it's something else. So of course, people are lying, right? I didn't grow up in an environment where people lied. And I didn't. If my father would confront me and say, "What did you?" There was no other thinkable option but to tell the truth, whatever the consequence would be. So where I'm trying to go with this, what I'm trying to say is that populism is latching onto a conservative mindset, but it is also betraying that conservative mindset, and that the basic values of conservatism are well grounded in truths that are accessible. They are not complicated. The truth of acting with decency towards your neighbor is not a complicated truth. Your neighbor is another human being like you. It's a fact. They suffer like you. It's a fact. So these basic truths, there is truth. We should want to access the truth. Other human beings are like us. Decency and character is important. Moral values are important. And not complicated moral values. Very easily accessible moral values. Don't do to your neighbor something you don't want done to yourself. Don't be evil. Don't be destructive. Don't be an ass. Be decent. These truths are accessible, and we can pass already a lot of political judgment through these simple, accessible truths. It doesn't need to be a complicated story about the statistical abnormalities of vaccine trials. It would be nice if we could access those truths as well, but usually we need to trust authority to access those truths because we may not have an education in microbiology or biochemistry. But there are other truths that we, all of us, each and every one of us, are perfectly capable of accessing, and we should not lose sight from those. They do not require the intermediation of narratives, they do not depend on storytelling. They are very immediately grounded in humanness, in being human. We should not surrender the truth, the accessible truth of our humanity. We should not become less than human. And if we do that, I think that is sufficient to prevent a catastrophe already. But we are so taken in by all the narratives, including the narrative that there is no such a thing as truth, or if there is, it's inaccessible, that we become very easy targets for manipulation. And true conservatives are now acting as the antithesis of conservatism. Conservatism is not about being dishonest. It's not about lying. It's not about committing crimes and being convicted. Conservatism is not about treating your neighbor like an enemy. This is not conservatism. Whatever it is, it's not conservatism. It's a knee-jerk emotional reaction to a true um, misdeed of governing elites. That was true. We have been lied to and manipulated, but you don't solve that by going for the guy who is lying and manipulating you even more, or the woman who is lying and manipulating you even more, who has convinced you that facts don't matter, that what matters is a narrative. That is the road to hell. And why do I say that? I'm not saying that because I'm an alarmist. I'm saying that because I'm a student of history, and this isn't even ancient history. I've known a lot of people who were alive as adults when this stuff happened. Let me give you an example. It will be an example that would be comparable to the US election, but I would do that only for illustrative purposes. The US election is a done deal. I don't think people are online are telling me, what should we do now? We should keep fighting. And I'm like, no, no, that's not how it works in a democracy. Once the results are out and they are fair, and these are fair as far as we know, there have been no massive irregularities. This is it. You fight the battle, or the battle is going. When the battle is over, there is no more battle to fight until when it comes up again. But I'm using this only for illustrative purposes, for the sake of other elections happening elsewhere in the Western world in the coming 4 years. When Hitler came to power in 1932, he was not the Hitler of 1939 that started the Second World War.
No.
He was a firecracker, but the German governing elites at the time, they thought he was harmless, that they could keep him under control, they could build guardrails, and that was the whole rationale for why he was appointed prime minister of Germany, and then proceeded to completely change the rules of government in Germany in order to create a totalitarian party, which was the Nazi party. The Na in Nazi comes from nationalism. And he hired people who were very good at that, like Joseph Goebbels. He was very good at
Yeah, and he studied it, and he really looked at himself and studied the voice, and it was a
yeah.
complete performance that he created to get that effect.
Yeah, Hitler. He studied his movements. He would photograph his
Exactly.
movements to study
Yeah.
them afterwards. He studied his tone of voice. He could
Mhm.
use voice amplification through electronic means for the first time at large scale,
Yeah, exactly. We
which
don't think
was
about that. The
yeah,
microphone. and
Yeah, now
actually
it's social media.
no, but using like what we were talking about earlier, hitting those emotional points in order to get that feeling that is it does have a physical effect, even if you can counteract it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And people will think that I am inventing this, but you're probably a student of history and you know that I'm not. The main theme of Hitler campaign was to make Germany great again. Maybe these words were not used, but that pretty much captured
They had
the
suffered
essence.
World War One, so they
Exactly.
had were giving money and they were the losers and they were looked at in a terrible way, and that was all about that what that propaganda did. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but yeah, it was about saying you're not a loser and you're strong and we're gonna show them. Yeah.
So an injustice had been committed to the German people. That was the Treaty of Versailles. That was
Hmm.
incredibly unjust for the Germans.
So much monetary compensation and
Oh, other things, even on an ongoing basis. In Western Germany, the French had the right to go in and take coal to heat their houses in the winter and leave no coal for the Germans. Today we talk about factory jobs. Others can come in and take our factory jobs, and we can't heat our houses in the winter because we don't pay our salaries. So the equivalent of that was taking coal away from the Germans. If a French officer would pass on the street and you are a German citizen, you had to remove your hat. If you wouldn't do that, you would be beaten up, you'd be lynched on the streets by French soldiers. So the Germans were humiliated people.
that's the word, humiliation, and being inhumane, really, as if the
They lost their
people weren't
dignity.
human.
They had a sense of lost dignity, which is what a lot of people in the West have for good reasons. This is not a hallucination. Liberal elites have treated heartland people with disdain for decades. This is not a hallucination. This has really happened. So that sense of being disempowered, disenfranchised, and of losing your dignity was very palpable then as it is now. But the point I want to make is how one can use or misuse legitimate grievances to manipulate a whole people into doing something that is good for that person and not for the people themselves. Because that's exactly what Hitler did. So he
Mhm.
preyed on the true grievance of loss of dignity of the Germans. He preyed on the fact that inflation was very high in Germany, that
Yeah.
people couldn't make ends meet. They would get their salary in the beginning of the month, and then at the end of the month, it was worth measurably less. But Hitler, who was not originally a politician, he wanted to be a painter, but although he was technically clever, he didn't have any he didn't have that extra thing that characterizes an artist.
Yeah.
So
He
he
didn't
failed
make it
at
into art
that.
school.
He didn't make it to art school, and then he became a corporal during the First World War. When the war ended, he thought it was a humiliation for the German peoples. After the war, he continued in the sphere of influence of the army, even though he was not a member of the army anymore, until one of his previous commanders asked him to infiltrate Communist Party meetings as a spy. That's how he got into politics. He was informally asked by the army to be a spy. And that's how his political career began, because he realized that he could speak well. And then later on, his whole platform was based on this gut emotional reaction of the German peoples who wanted their dignity back. And he realized there was a tremendous collective psychic power behind that. True grievances are things that if you can manipulate, they give you enormous power. You can play people like marionettes because that emotional force is unstoppable in the human psyche. If you can channel it in a direction that favors you, the country is now, they are your servants now. So Hitler deliberately focused on channeling that and outwardly trying to restore dignity to the German peoples and speaking from their point of view, speaking with anger because that's what they felt. When people are angry and you speak with anger, you connect with the speaker. Nonetheless, despite it being a clear in your face form of manipulation, it still works. And in the case of Hitler, it was even more plausible than in the case of Trump because Hitler was a man of the people. And Trump was born in a golden crib as a product of the elites of New York. So it is less plausible, but it worked still. It still worked. So we have historical precedences for all this, and this is why I'm so worried about the future, because the echoes are uncanny. Hitler tried a putsch before he was really elected, and he hardly served anything. He was convicted of insurrection.
The criminal thing, I hadn't thought of that also as
Yeah,
parallel. Yeah,
and
but his jail cell was very nice, right? And he was getting
yeah,
letters
it was
and
a bit
writing books. Didn't he
semi-open.
write his book in jail? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he could receive friends. He basically had free lodging and meals.
He wrote this propaganda book or
Mein
something,
Kampf.
but yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah. My
My struggle
battle,
or
my struggle.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And when he came to power, people also thought, no, no, the system is robust. There are guardrails. He can't just do what he wants. His worst instincts, we can manage them. We can keep them under control. And then he became the Hitler of 1939 with no guardrails, with complete control over all three branches of government. He controlled the courts, he controlled the legislative, and he controlled the executive. Um,
Oh
and
gosh, another
that
parallel, close parallel,
yeah,
almost parallel.
the man of the people who was angry and populist, but people thought cannot be so bad, right? He has been around for 20 years. And yes, he tried an insurrection, but only a couple of people were shot and killed. It was not a big thing. He hardly served any time anyway, although he was convicted. And probably, he shouldn't have served any time at all because he was trying to do the right thing, even though it was against the law. Who can trust the law anymore in Germany, given what's happening? The government is now our enemy, and an enemy of our enemy is our friend. That's how the thought goes. And throughout it, nobody understood what it would become. Otherwise, it would have stopped. Once people began to understand it, they tried to kill Hitler 32 times, if I remember, and they never died. There was always
No.
a strike of luck. For us to heed, what it tells us is the way to combat these things is not through crime. It's not through taking them out. One, it doesn't work. Two, even if it did, the next guy is worse and will feel even more vindictive. And the whole thing will just become reinforced. You start
Mhm.
creating martyrs and mobilize those ugly energies, which are human but are dangerous even more. So that's the reason of my concern. It's historical parallels, and Hitler is just one. And people may say, "Oh, you're exaggerating." When people in 1932 started raising the alarm, that's exactly what they were told. You're exaggerating. Now he's just an army corporal. He's a silly guy. He's not even very intelligent. What could he do? No, what can go wrong? So that's my concern. I'm not saying that this will happen again. I literally pray every night to be wrong and for the people that are against me to be right. But no, I'm very concerned.
Here's what bothers me too is that, so in a way, I feel like Kamala did take the high road, so to speak, in terms of not that she was like perfect in not taking on those tactics, but I do think there was an attempt not to fall victim to that pattern that obviously seemed to be working in terms of, yeah, like using those propaganda tools. However, the campaign was built on saving the country from basically what you just laid out, but not laid out in that way. While at the same time, this attrition that I think you're describing had already been taking place because we'd had 4 years with him in the United States and the world didn't end. And there's some kind of weird attrition and also acclimatization that's happening where you just he's become so normal and that spirit has become so normal that it's very easy not to take seriously. And then, but at the same time, it's still very attractive because it's entertaining. There's this element of the truth can be boring or it's not. Like this is a lot of this is about time, and hopefully we can talk about that in a minute because these different nested layers of time matter a lot. But in the moment, these tactics are more exciting. Everyone's on their phone looking at TikTok and or these like very short little videos. So time wise, I think we're very addicted to these entertaining, quick kind of zaps of things that get our attention. And all the stuff you've been talking about is true, but I'm not sure we the time feels different. It feels like a lot of people aren't really taking the time to realize they're being manipulated. And if they do realize they're being manipulated, it doesn't really seem to matter as much because of the way the time is moving so quickly. And so, yeah, I don't know. I guess just, do you think this like attrition and this where we just get used to it, it's almost like the frog in the water. I don't even know if that story is true, and you turn it up slowly. It seems to be
Historical.
happening at once, that we've gotten used to it, and also we still need more and more hits of entertainment. Like Trump is going to be much more entertaining the next 4 years, you know? That seems to matter a little bit in certain unconscious, I don't really know about the term unconscious, but in ways we haven't thought about. Or
These things happen slowly. The metaphor of the frog in the water gets slowly warmer, but the frog doesn't notice it because it goes slowly until the frog boils and dies. Historically, that's how things have happened. That's how the French Revolution has happened. That frog was boiling very slowly until it blew, and the royals were killed, and hundred thousands
right.
of people were killed by the guillotine.
If you change the temperature quickly, the frog jumps out of it, but if it's
Yeah.
slow, it's also what de Tocqueville wrote about in the US, right? With the sheep in the pasture, this mentality that over time people just go with what the temperature of the water.
Look, democracy is the least bad form of government we have figured out so far. There is nothing better than it, because any other form of government starts conflating the person in power with the institutions and the country. And once that conflation happens, now you're back to feudalism and dictatorships. And the end of those is not pretty. And the people are not going to have a good future. We know that historically too. But in democracy, every vote counts the same, whether the person who votes is thoughtful or not. And we are not going to change that, because that's just the spectrum of human beings. Some people are impulsive, other people are less impulsive. It's just the variability of our characteristics. And there is nothing good or bad about it. It's just what we are, it's just how we are put together. But because a lot of people will not be thoughtful about it and they will vote irresponsibly,
Which is, I think,
governments.
why the other side takes on those tactics, right? In that emergency situation, it feels like you just have to do everything you can, which means you just take on the propaganda stance in order to try to just convince them because of what
Yeah,
you just said.
in an emergency situation, yes, but even outside emergency situations, governments calculate that the true reasons for some of the stuff they do are too subtle and nuanced to be communicated, and they would be misunderstood and exploited for the wrong reasons, and therefore governments don't explain certain things they do. I'll give you an example, which is worldwide applicable now. In the whole Western world, it's applicable now. We have enormous frustration about illegal immigration. This is not only a US issue, it's perhaps an even bigger issue in Europe,
Oh, yeah.
Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. Um, it's baffling to us that governments are so slow to tackle illegal immigration. By the way, I am against illegal immigration because I am against everything that is illegal. I think we should, if we think that something is positive for the country, we should make it legal and then implement it, but not implement it until it has first been made legal, even if it leads to delays. So I am against illegal immigration. I think the frustration people feel in Western Europe is real and valid, but they are not being told why governments are so lax about immigration, because the story, it's not even complex, but they think it's not simple enough for a political message, which has to be a sort of pill format. And the reason for that is that we are having an inversion of our demographic pyramid for the first time in human history. It's not that we don't have enough people. 100 years ago, we had a lot less people and we were fine. So the problem is not that we are becoming too few and therefore we need immigration to compensate. That's not the problem. The problem is the inverted pyramid. For the first time in history, all of history, there soon will be a lot more old people than there are young people. And through all of history, it has been the opposite. You have much more younger people than you have old people. And that's a healthy demographic pyramid, because it's the young people who take care of the old. It's the young people who pay for the pension of the old. My pension contributions today are going to the people who are retired today. They don't keep it, they don't stay in a pot waiting for my retirement. That's not how the economic game works. So when I retire, in 19.9 years, when I'm 69 years and 9 months. When that happens, there will be a lot less people in their 30s contributing to my pension. There will be a lot less people who are nurses in hospitals to take care of me when I get sick and when I need to stay a week in hospital. There will be a lot less people to clean my gutter, to do my garden, to do maintenance. And that is the problem. The problem is not that there are few people. The problem is that there will be a lot of old people and very few young people. So in that situation, which is not talked about openly by politicians because it's considered a difficult message to give, when Angela Merkel, Mama Merkel, who used to be the chancellor of Germany, when she saw 1 million educated Syrians at the door, young and educated, it was like Santa Claus had just come. It's the salvation of German industry. German industry now suffers from three problems, all of them equally bad: Chinese competition, higher energy prices because of Russia's violent invasion of Ukraine, and lack of workforce. We don't find people to operate the machines, to maintain the machines, to do the jobs that we need to be done. So when she saw the 1 million there, she thought, "My God, that's a Christmas gift, a present from God." It, and then, of course, the message is, "Oh, we Germans, we are nice people. We care about other people, so we will let them in." That's also true, but it's not the reason why a politician takes a major political gamble. The reason she did it is that she saw something that she knew couldn't be just sincerely and openly communicated with the population because they thought people are too unthoughtful, too dumb, too gullible to be included into a mature conversation about future problems, right? And then, of course, it still backfired because you can't just bring 1 million people in just like that. There is no cultural acclimatization, and then it went bad in the Christmas of 2015. I was there when that happened, when these
Oh, really?
gangs of Syrians started manhandling women and abusing women. There was one rape. So that's not how you do immigration anyway. I'm not defending what Merkel did. I'm actually against it. I think she made a major mistake there. I am against illegal immigration. I don't think it should happen. But I understand the rationales for why governments are so lax enforcing immigration rules. Amongst people who study these things, people are looking at the future of different Western nations. The US is considered to be in the most enviable position of all Western nations because the US has a ready source of immigration for young people coming from Latin America. The US has raw materials. The US doesn't even import oil anymore. It's a net exporter of oil. It imports, but it's a net exporter. It exports more than it imports energy products. So the US is in the most enviable and sustainable position going forward. And one of the factors for that is that it has a ready source of immigration. Now, why don't governments have that adult discussion with us and stop thinking that everybody's stupid? What has happened in the US recently is not going to improve this situation because the lesson that the others are learning is that no, flat out in your face lie and manipulation works. So
Hmm.
now the chance that they will engage in a thoughtful, mature conversation with their constituencies is even lower. Maturity is down the drain. Adulthood is down the drain. What we have now is teenage politics that appeal to raw emotions and not reason, not fact, and not truth. It's entirely based on manipulation. It's going to get worse. Why? Because obviously it is working. And even the people who would rather not to do that, they would justify to themselves, looking in the mirror, that they have to do it because otherwise the other side, the evil guys, will always win. And that's how the world goes to hell. We will try to outcompete each other in dishonest behavior. And we will still morally justify that because the other side is more dishonest. And the other side is thinking the same. The other side is thinking the liberal elites who have been in power for decades, there has to be a reaction to that. We cannot let that game keep on going. It's ridiculous. They have to pay a price for this. They have to be put in their place. So we will vote for the rabbit deranged hyena and destroy the system. Some people may think like that. Others think that inflation was so high they can't pay for their groceries anymore. They have to vote somebody in who is different. All the thoughtfulness is lost in these dynamics. For instance, every political or economic cause produces an effect with a delay. In geopolitics, that delay can be several years. In economics, at least a couple of years. No economic decision today has an economic effect next month. That's not how it works. That's not, the systems are too complicated. The impact of a new action has to just tram it through a complicated system until it produces an effect on the other hand, and that takes time. So people are now judging governments for the effects produced by other governments. For instance, the whole world was suffering from inflation. That's still an echo of the 2008 financial crisis and things that happened later. But governments are being judged from day one for the inflation that's happening at that moment. We don't think retroactively. How did we end here? What was done to end here? In the US, I was alarmed by how many people on my social media feed were saying Trump, there were no wars in Trump's government. So Trump's
Yeah.
decisions are conducive to peace.
He was saying that,
Of
so
course,
everyone
he would
else was
say
saying
that.
it. He was
It
pumping it into
works.
social media.
Yeah, it works. And people will repeat it. People
Yeah.
will believe it because it sounds reasonable. But it's plain to anybody who thinks about it that one of the key causes of the Ukraine war was the fact that in his first term, Trump weakened the Western alliance and severely weakened Western deterrence. And that's what people lose from sight. Military deterrence prevents wars. If we were to stop military spending tomorrow, there would be a world war very quickly because we are not alone in the world. Western values, the Western alliance is not alone in the world. There are the other guys, totalitarian dictatorships, totalitarian systems that we want to have very large piece of our pie, of
Yeah. You have to have a
prosperity
very strong military in order not to use it.
in order not to have wars. And look, this has worked for 80 years in the European continent. We have not had a major land war in the European continent for about 80 years. Yes, we had the Yugoslav wars. They were terrible. They were catastrophes. It's a shame that they happened. We must do everything we can to prevent those kinds of conflicts, but they were not a major land war at the scale we are having now in Ukraine. Why did the Ukraine war happen? Because Putin thought he could get away with it. NATO was weakened, the Western alliance was in disarray, there were disagreements, Trump threatened to even leave NATO, and Putin saw an opportunity. Now, once he sees the opportunity, of course, it takes a couple of years to prepare an invasion like that. Things don't happen immediately in economics, in politics, in geopolitics. We have to think with a lag. You have to build a lag into your conclusions, and that's what people don't do. You can look, it's understandable why people don't do that, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the moral responsibility. They still carry the moral responsibility. And I think what Trump did carries moral responsibility for what we are facing in this continent right now. Military deterrence stops conflicts. You don't create peace by dismantling deterrence, by dismantling existing alliances that have maintained peace for 80 years, which is an empirical fact, despite all the tensions in this continent where I am, and which all of you came from, if you trace your history far enough.
Yeah,
Uh,
we're
uh,
all immigrants.
it's a fact that we had a lot of built-in tensions here, and we were solving those tensions as they should be solved through commerce, through diplomacy, through talks, through changes of law, through international agreements, until one country thought that takes too long and I see an opening. The West is weakened, the West is in disarray, I can get away with genocide. And here we are. And there is another danger. A populist tends to be impulsive. Populism is an impulsive movement that the populist politicians that are in a position of leadership arrive in that position because they are the best politicians to mobilize the people along their lines of thinking and the best people to mobilize their population through emotion like anger, the need for revenge, to be one up on the other guys who have lied to you for so long. The best way to mobilize people through these raw emotions are impulsive people. Impulsive people speak the language of emotions. So they are the politicians that find themselves in power. And in populism, that's what you find, impulsive politicians in power. That character trait is such that you can easily find yourself in a situation in which you have a populist politician who is sincerely going for peace. I have no doubt Trump sincerely wants peace. I have no doubt about that at all. It's not part of his agenda to start a war. It makes his life more complicated. But because of impulsiveness, not only his, but many other populist politicians, post truth politicians, in their efforts to bring about peace, if they perceive for a moment that the other state actors involved are not respecting them, not taking them seriously, poo pooing their efforts, or offending them in some way, they're liable to instantly switch to the other extreme, which is to show you that I've got a bigger rocket. If a situation of tremendous geopolitical tension in the world today, with a liberal thought of nuclear weapons, impulsiveness is incredibly dangerous. Particularly, you don't really have checks and balances anymore because you control all branches of government through a policy of loyalty above reason. This is incredibly dangerous.
I can see how we aren't seeing that side of it. I mean, a lot of people think like Trump and Putin go together, or all these people, the macho kind of personalities, like they're going to team up and somehow
become buddies.
Yeah, but the danger is actually more the opposite, that there will be impulsive kind of ego manipulations going on.
There are other dangers. You can force peace. The US has enough leverage to force peace on anything anywhere in the world. But that's just semblant of peace, because what you did, you bottled up a conflict that will flare up again at a much larger scale, because both parties will have time to reconstitute and rearm even better than before, and the whole thing blows up again. Tito enforced peace in Yugoslavia for decades.
Mm,
Tito
gosh.
enforced it.
Yeah.
The tensions were all there. Nothing was fundamentally resolved. No grievance, no disagreement. Nothing was resolved. You just enforced peace. So
But
you can bottle up the Ukraine conflict now. Are you solving it? No. It will blow up again. It will be maybe 10 times worse. So that's the other danger as well.
I wonder though, because when is the last time that you were in the United States? Was it recently or?
A couple of years ago.
Yeah, because it feels different there. I'm always shocked by it. And it's when I actually enter that atmosphere, things always look very different to me than they did when I'm here in Europe. There's something about even like going back this time, and I felt it is a kind of country that's looking at the things that seem to be in the optics of the Trump administration in terms of like money, and in terms of what I was saying about just this overall spirit or habit that many of us have of looking at that third space that you were describing that we've made with language and art and videos and stuff. Mostly it's via videos now, or it's via podcast or YouTube, or there's this other kind of world there that is very hard to distinguish the choices you're making in reality. And I guess that connects to what you were saying about truth, but I think it feels much more complicated there, and also much simpler in a way, that there's not all this philosophical mediation, that that emotional cueing is actually working on a really immediate and fast level that seems at a pace that's hard to even notice or stop. Like it just, without maybe some kind of a big disaster, or I don't know, but and there's also this feeling of that, yes, I know Trump might not think he's telling the truth, or he might, I don't know, but there's this honest liar kind of thing about it. But there's also this feeling, which I heard from a lot of people, of yeah, he's getting better, and he's going to change. And there's actually some truth, like if he actually did become a person who cared and put other people first, he would have an incredible amount of power towards doing good things. That's actually true, right? Because he really could. He really is in the position where a lot of people would follow him if he really decided to do good things in the world. It's really true. And I heard a lot of people saying, well, he's going to change. He's, now that he had this death threat and he almost died, and there's that story too going on.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's in a way much more complicated than it seems, and also much more immediate and visceral and emotional and optic. The advantage. Yeah.
I think even the people who vote for him are now realizing, okay, we did what we did, and he has complete control
Yeah.
of
What did we do? Or what is this? Nobody
and
knows.
of course they would spin a positive narrative. I sincerely wish that narrative turns out to be true. I sincerely
Yeah,
wish
me
that that's
too.
what will happen.
But this
I
was before the vote. This was when I
Yeah.
was talking to people about their vote, even people who had voted for Biden and now were going to vote for Trump or something, that it was almost like, and I understood, like from here, that seemed crazy to me. But when I went back into the country, I don't know, it almost like you go into the atmosphere and I understood it better. And I understood that kind of confusion between him being familiar and that feeling like you could trust it and it was going to turn in a good way. And also, of course, all the other underlying layers that we think we've come farther in the States than we have in terms of what people will vote for. Yeah, I don't know. It just felt
Yeah.
like there's so many complicated themes. In some ways, we've progressed so far. I could tell you stories of things when I was a kid that now are normal in terms of more justice and fairness and acceptance. But then on the other level, there's all these very real emotional threads that I think are actually making the decisions in an immediate kind of way that has nothing to do much with contemplation or, yeah, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's very human.
Yeah.
I The final week of the campaign, I followed the words of both candidates. And people ask me, which broadcaster did you use? I'm watching CNN, you'll be manipulated. No, no, forget this. I'm listening to the words they said. I'm not listening to political commentary. I was appalled by Trump saying that Liz Cheney should be shot in the head with 9 barrels pointed to her face. I think those were the kind of alarming statements that overshadow any other possible rationale you could have about a candidate for the leadership of the free world. It just overrides everything else. You don't need even to look at the competition, whether the competition is good or not. That's a disqualifying attitude to take. And that happened after both attempts at his life. So I do not see any sign that his empathy is growing or that he will put the interest of the people above his own. All signs I see are warning signs. Every more or less level headed person he worked with in his first administration actively campaigned against him. There was only one exception. I do not see any positive signs, which doesn't mean that it won't be positive. It may be positive, despite the complete lack of signs that it may be. And that's what I hope. Now, I think we should also not be too naive and put all the blame on the lies, the deception, the in your face emotional manipulation of legitimate grievances. We should not put the blame in the lack of thoughtfulness of voters. These are all facts. But if we don't also look to the other side and understand that part of the failure was the inability of the system to produce a plausibly positive alternative. And I don't want to insult Kamala Harris or her voters. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I think the only alternative to populism is a political movement that, for the first time, actually be sincere, honest, and treat people like adults, as opposed to
Yes.
using the
Yes,
Nazi
exactly.
created forms of political manipulation and propaganda that we've learned in the 1940s.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's exactly what I was trying to say with those emails and things, that although I think she did that in certain ways, like there's difference between the person and then this third mediated space of all the stuff that you get in social media and so on, which, I love what you're saying about just, can we just be direct about here's the reason we need immigration, and can we just be like, treat people like they can handle it? And for me, that's what I wanted in this election, and what would have showed the truth about certain statements that, like the ones you just said from Trump, which are just overwhelmingly wrong, and people know it, but they don't hear them or see them that way. They just think, oh, it's just, crazy stuff and he doesn't mean it, because there's no clear contrast of just the truth, because the truth seems so hard to say. And because those tactics are the ones you're still like, you hear the same tone in maybe not her, but in the people that are representing her to you and in these other ways. So that also adds to that where it just doesn't seem like there's a contrast, right? Yeah. But just being like treating people, coming honestly, why is that so hard to just treat people like in that way?
It's hard because you think that you don't get enough airtime, that people will not give you enough attention span for you to actually make your case. It's hard because our political parties are in a kind of a competition game. In the ideal world, you would say what you think, regardless of whether the polls are telling you that the population agrees with you or not, right? You would say what you think, and then people decide whether it's in agreement with their views or not. But what we have now is politicians adjusting their message according to the polls. So they're trying to say what they think the people want, as opposed to what their their knowledge and their awareness of the situation informs them about, which is what they should do, because vote is an instrument of trust. It is impossible for each and every one of us to inform ourselves to the degree that our representatives in Congress or in the executive can inform themselves about the relevant issues, because it's their job to do that, while I have to go to work every day and you have to go to work every day. We are busy with other things, so we outsource a study of the relevant facts to our representatives, and then we try to trust their judgment. But politicians know that's not what we do. That's not what we do. What we do is we think we can judge better than them, and we will vote for the candidate that tells me what I want to hear.
They're going to send you a paycheck, more
Yeah,
or less, was the message.
yeah, we are not outsourcing that job of evaluating the mountains of data and facts and rationales that we can't evaluate ourselves because we have other jobs. That's not our job, it's their job. We don't have this mentality of outsourcing trust. We think we know better. That's an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. We don't know enough to understand that we don't know enough. And that leads to a vicious circle. We think we know better.
Yeah.
Um, and politicians know that. So that's why they don't treat us as partners. They don't just give us their rationale based on what they know for what they want to do. They try to win instead. And politics has become a game, it's like a football game in the stadium. You root for one team, you root for the other, and you see who wins. Um, If Books is going to publish a book precisely on this theme, a fantastic book. It's coming in a few months. Um, that's why we are not treated as adults. For the current chancellor of Germany is trying to treat people as adults. He's going to lose the election. Because he has
Well, yeah.
also not been very effective. Now his government is a bit of a mess. Different members of government are trying to do different things. There is no coordination. So yeah, there is a level of incompetence there. But he did try to tell the facts, and it has backfired. I think we should try, some political movement should have the courage to once at least try to say it as it is. Right now, their calculation, let's take two examples. Let's take immigration. Their calculation is the following: I want to win, I want to stay in power. What is the worst of the two options here? Now, option number one, I do not enforce immigration rules, but I will make sure that in 4 years there are enough nurses in the hospital. And then I'll suffer a backlash for immigration. But if I don't do that and I really enforce immigration rules, a few years down the pike, people will end in hospital and there will be nobody to take care of them. And that will be a massive national scandal. They would think the country became a third world country, a banana republic. How can it be? My father needed surgery and they couldn't operate on him because there aren't enough nurses in the hospital, incompetent government. They think the latter would be worse. So they take the fallout of the former. That's the calculation. I think a political force should emerge that just tells people, here are the facts, here are our judgments of the facts. It's our job to spend our full time looking at these facts, analyzing scenario, gaming it out through simulations, and here are our conclusions. And therefore, we will make this choice instead of that choice. Let's try to treat people as adults for once, as opposed to just doing PR and playing a game of who is better at manipulating the public. I think if we try to do that, the result may be surprising because we just haven't tried in 80 years. We haven't bloody tried.
You just gave an example of that someone who's tried. Here's what I think. I think that's totally true. And at the same time, it's not either or, because I think there still needs to be some kind of performative aspect to it. Can you be performative and attention grabbing in a way that's also presenting the truth? Because I think we need like both, because it goes back to that just physical reaction of what gets your feeling and attention and emotion, and most people are going to go with that. So, can you be an honest person and still create your message in a way that is emotional in that sense? Because those, I feel like we seem to think that if you're doing that, then you must be evil, right? If you're using propaganda. And that feels like maybe that's not right either, because like, why shouldn't we try to, I mean, I talk to myself too, because I'm one of these people, I don't wear makeup. I'm just like very, always as I am. And I've started thinking maybe it's like maybe you do owe people something in a way to help them keep their attention. Or maybe I need to rethink that if you're trying to look a certain way or put on a certain performance, that necessarily means you're not being authentic or true. Maybe those two things aren't either or. And maybe trying to separate them is also creating these more of these divisions, to where like this inertia is pushing us into certain kinds of categories that we can't break out of. Because the truth doesn't have to be boring.
It's fine to polish the message so long as you treat people as adults. Otherwise, you're feeding the opposition. I'll give you another example. It is true that the COVID vaccine studies have shown could have terrible side effects. By the way, that was true for just about every other vaccine humankind has invented, and which are directly responsible for the massive improvement in childhood survival that we've had over the past 150 years or so, 100 years. It is true, catastrophic things happened to certain people. It is true that vaccines were not 100% safe. Studies have shown that, plenty of studies. But instead of having this adult conversation with the population and saying, despite this, the statistics and the models show us that if we deploy the vaccine, then certain people have terrible side effects. But if we don't deploy the vaccine, hundreds of thousands more will die. We think that we should bite the bullet, take the risk, and vaccinate. And we think you should choose to be vaccinated because your chance of dying of COVID without a vaccine outweighs your chance of having a serious side effect. It is a risk. You will be taking a risk, but you'll be taking a risk either way, by vaccinating or not vaccinating.
Hmm.
And all data indicates that the risk is lesser if you do vaccinate. And then you vaccinate and you have terrible side effects. You've been treated like an adult. You knew what the stakes were. You knew what the rationale was. But if instead we tell people vaccines are always safe, which is what happened, you're feeding the opposition, because of course those cases in which the vaccine was not safe, they will pop into the media, and then the other side will tell you, look, they have been lying to you.
Hmm.
So you always hand gifts to the populist demagogues by not treating the population as adults.
Okay, I agree. What about this though? Because we're not like, so if you come on and you say the truth, right? Then, and you say both sides, then 1 hour later maybe you're going to see a soundbite where you just see one side presented. And so then that is going to be spread everywhere. This happens, right?
Yeah.
And then it's also become a sign of weakness, right? Because that's the presentation of Trump as a very self-help oriented thing that sort of says you must always say what you want to happen, and you never concede that you've done anything wrong. You never say anything bad about yourself. You never admit to doing wrong. Like, your language itself, every little detail is always on one side, which is the side that you are right and that things are positive. He's very much followed that playbook, which is a self-help playbook, but it could also taken to extreme. It is. And he's schooled in that. He learned from that, some of the teachers of that self-help philosophy as young. He's very much doing that in the most direct way. And if you just come with what you just said and you say things as they are, at least in the short term, all that's going to happen. All that's going to happen is he's going to say, it doesn't have to be him, but
Yeah,
it will get said, they said this, and it'll just be half of what you said that was taken. And
yeah,
that's the only thing anyone will ever hear. And at least most people. And so the narrative, we're back to narratives, has been completely changed from the way that you've put it into the world. Now, if everyone was doing that over time and time, maybe over time, it would change the pattern, and what is now accepted as normal would change. And hopefully maybe that's even what's happening. But if we just look at the short term, people who try to be honest don't get the honest thing that they said represented in that third world
yeah, yeah.
media land.
Look, in a normal situation, there will be facts you will make publicly available as an honest government that treats the people as adults. They will put the entire story out, publicly available to everyone. And then what you describe will happen. But there will be also those voices uh, uh, calling them out and saying, he showed you only half the clip. Here's the whole thing available in the USA.gov website, whatever it is. And through social media, peer to peer criticism will work out in a way that eventually, given some time, like you described, everything will go back to the original statement, because the original statement will be fully open. And social media will ensure that through these self checks and self criticisms, that the truth will emerge. Why is it not working right now? It's because it's well crafted enough to preemptively insulate the dynamics I just explained. And the way they preemptively prevent this dynamic from happening is by denying the very existence of truth or fact. It's by there is a political philosopher called Vlad Drexler who has a very nice YouTube channel. He has explained this ad nauseum in a very accessible way. But the game here is to say, whatever you will see, even if you see the complete original statement, you cannot trust even that either, because there is nothing to trust. And how do they do that? They do that by inserting conflicting messages into the airwaves. That's what Russian propaganda does. Soviet propaganda would present you an alternative reality, but an internally consistent one. Russian propaganda would tell you it is A. Next day they say, no, it's B. And then next day it's C. And A and B and C are all contradictory. And the idea is that it will cause you to throw your arms up and give up on the very idea that truth exists or that you can ever hope to learn it. So that's the mechanism that is used to prevent what I just described. Otherwise, what I just described would eventually work, even if it took time. But people are now manipulated into giving up on truth as a value. Even if you can't access it, at least you want it. Now people have given up on the very idea of there being something that was actually true, that something that was actually said.
But it's for that exact reason, isn't it? That there's
No, no,
something very strange. Like, I always think if people understood that they're being manipulated, and if they understood that they need to double check everything, that would change a lot of this. But how do you really, if you're just in the moment being stimulated and going with your stimulation, you don't really, most people aren't going to take the time to go check on us.gov or whatever. And first of all, that whole thing is going to have to be controlled by people who are doing the right thing too. There's so many layers to it all that I guess that's what I was saying about maybe we need a performance kind of aspect to it, because you're going to have to start right with the emotional, and somehow that at that level you're going to have to introduce this way of being able to hold the paradox and being able to say nothing I hear is 100% true, and there is truth, right? You really can't trust anything you hear because it's coming from a particular perspective, and there's truth, right? Like, how do
Yeah, but
people get that? You need a soundbite almost. You need a that message needs to be somehow understood. It's not an easy one.
populism is very well crafted. Those people know what they are doing, and so they are actively preempting all of those alternatives we are discussing now. I'll give you another example. Um, if you abandon the very value of truth, um, all that is left for you is to destroy. There is nothing to construct because the foundation of construction is a foundation of what is true, right? What is
Yeah,
good,
that's a
what
really
is
important
true.
point, which it speaks to all these crises, right? Like
Yeah,
meaning crisis, meta crisis, poly crisis, all this
yeah.
crisis
Y-
that
y- you vote in someone because that someone you think is going to destroy the system that you've come to hate. You're not voting to reform or reconstruct or rebuild. You're voting to destroy. That's the human emotional, primordial gut emotional reaction.
or you're voting to identify and become more confident. You mentioned humiliation earlier, which I think is a very much a motivating force. I'll tell you a story really quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you want to go ahead and finish your point
No, no,
first?
no, no. Now I want to hear.
Okay, I was in a cab. I had a lot of interesting cab conversations in the States, right? Or Lyft or Uber or whatever. And one of them was a young man who he had voted for Kamala. He was I think he'd been in the States like 15 years, and but he was telling me most of his friends had voted for Trump and that he was shocked. And he was also telling me that how he'd had a person get in his car recently before the election who had pretty much harassed him, was grabbing his hoodie and knocking his hat off and telling him he better vote for Trump because, he basically also accusing him like, where did you get this car? Did you steal it? I've I was born in America and I don't have a car as nice as this. So the two things in that story that I think are important, and I wonder how it fits with what you're saying, is the macho thing, and that people feel like they don't want to be humiliated and they want to feel powerful, and that's what's being represented by that macho mindset, which is disgusting, right? And it's the same reason he couldn't believe the women had voted for Trump, because in his mind, as he told me, like they're treating women as if they own them. But that's very real and it works. That power of, if you feel weak or you feel vulnerable or you feel insecure, identifying with someone who tells you they're strong and you're strong. Do you know what I mean?
We handed it to them because, um, again, in the Netherlands, this is perfectly coherent. In the US, it's a contradiction in terms, but I'm a liberal conservative. I believe in values. I believe in the Netherlands, we say norms and values. Traditional ones, even if they're not wrong, we keep whatever has worked traditionally, we should keep on doing it, right? That's why I'm a traditionalist. I'm not a traditionalist in the sense of sticking to costumes that were terrible and refusing to reform them. That's just blindness, it's stupidity. But I like to hold on to what works. So I'm largely a conservative for US standards. Um, and therefore see that because in the US there are only two options, right? There is no space for nuance. There are only two drawers. You have to classify everything in only two drawers. Because of that, a lot went into the other drawer, the liberal drawer. It was exaggerated. I think the origins of the what we call the woke movement today were based on decency and their respect to human freedom. If some people are born with male sex, but psychologically they belong in the female gender. Who are we to tell them that their experience is wrong? And who are we to force them to live in a way that's not natural to them? As long as they don't infringe on my freedom, I shall not infringe on theirs. As long as they allow me to live as I want, I will not infringe on their right to live as they want. This is a very conservative discourse, right? The preservation of individual freedom. But it went well over the top. And that was a gift that the left hand over to populism. It's the exaggerations of woke. We've got to the point where even though maybe no politician ever actually said this, but the idea has come to dominate the airwaves now that according to woke, men and women are equal. They have equal rights. They have equal value. They are complementary. But to ignore a biological difference and a difference in certain mental dispositions is silly. Statistically, those differences are there. And that was a gift to the other side because they can misportray it, they can misuse it to convey this message that they are after your manhood, that being a man is not a bad thing, that all maleness is male toxicity or toxic masculinity. And although none of this was actually said quite in this way, because of the exaggerations of woke, we handed over a gift to the other side to portray things in this way. And that has made young men, and when you are young, you are insecure, let's be honest. You're still testing your
I mean, most
sexuality.
people are insecure and are
Yeah.
afraid of things. That's just
So
how it
you
is.
create this threat that the other side handed over to you like a gift, and you use it to create a threat that plays exactly on male insecurity, young male insecurity, something that seems to invalidate their very malehood. And they will react to that. And then people will leverage that. Jordan Peterson has leveraged this liberally, saying traditional values and malehood. A lot of that I agree with. I just disagree with how blatantly misused it is. It is misused. So the other side bears a responsibility because of the exaggerations, the extremes, and the inability to provide a truly viable alternative. It is not difficult to present someone who will appeal to people's humanity more than an orange, overweight, uh, um, unhinged, angry man, right? It's not difficult to find an appealing alternative to something like that.
But I have to say, I don't. I think that's not helpful or true either. To like, it's something I've done too. Is just think of him in that way because what he's not. He doesn't appear that way actually in the States to the people. He's not a joke anymore in that way, which is a shock for me when I went back there. Even to me, he doesn't appear that way. Um,
I don't think he's a
he's
joke.
very familiar and he's not monster-like, which
Oh,
is
no, no.
much more dangerous than it was 8
Don't
years
get me
ago when he
wrong.
was, you know?
When I say an angry man, I don't mean a monster. When I say deranged, I don't mean crazy. But when somebody goes on television says his political opponent should be put against a wall and shot from 9 barrels, if that is not somebody operating without guardrails, then what is it? When a political candidate for president of the nation of the world's most powerful nation does not have enough moral guardrails to not call for the assassination of a political opponent. If this is not deranged, what is? Oh,
Of course, he wasn't calling for the assassination.
no, he
He
was.
was
He
yeah.
literally was. But people say, well, it's just Trump. It's what he does. He doesn't really mean it.
So you
That,
think he was literally
that
saying
no, I don't think it's a fact. That's what he said.
honestly, I haven't watched him actually say it, so
He said that Liz Cheney belongs in front of 9 barrels. He literally said that her place is in front of an execution squad. He said the words. It played back. It's there. He said the words. Now you may say he doesn't really mean it. It's just Trump being Trump. That's how Hitler was seen in
I
1932.
agree. And it's not only that phrase. There's so many phrases about so many things. But I guess
And
what I'm trying to say is that when it doesn't it's so shocking and so awful that you don't take it seriously. It's some kind of weird spiraling kind of
uh,
movement where it's very hard like, it's almost for some reason I think of In Dead Poet Society with this movie, which I like, when the woman's son actually dies and she doesn't accept it. It was always really hard for me to watch that part. Like, she acts like he's still alive because some things are just so glaringly awful or wrong that you can't process them as what they are. I feel like there's something like that going on.
when Again, I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler. I'm drawing parallels here because the parallels exist. And the fact that there are parallels doesn't mean that everything will go now the way they went after 1932. They may, but I'm not saying that's going to be the case. I'm just justifying simply my concern. When Hitler was campaigning in the election of 1932, which, by the way, he didn't really win. The Nazi Party was not the biggest party. He was just the one that was eventually selected to lead the country after talks of coalition and all that. But that's how people reacted. He had some extreme statements that people thought, yeah, and it's just the corporal being the corporal. It's just that he's full of passion and he really cares about the dignity of the German people. So he says these things, but no, he's never going to do that. He's not going to do that
Mhm.
until he did. And the way he
And even
started,
then, right? Even when people knew what was happening, they didn't see it.
you
You
know,
know.
when he actually started doing that, and he actually started doing that against his own people, he killed the leader of the brown shirts, which was his own political movement. But because
Mhm.
the guy was growing too powerful and too visible, Hitler saw him as a threat. Killing is, and that happened to Putin as well. Killing is a wonderful way to solve your problems because it's a definitive solution when your problem is what another person is doing. Killing is addictive. Once you get that path of solving your problems by killing, nothing else is as good. Nothing else is as immediate, as complete, as sure, and as easy to do. And that was the downward spiral of Hitler, too, as it was a downward spiral of Putin, who started killing in the early 2000s. Political opponents, journalists, and all that. Um, when Hitler actually started doing that, the effect was then, oh yeah, he's doing that, but he has been saying for years that he was going to do that. So at no point there is that moment of alarm. Because when he's saying it and not doing, he's just saying it. But when he's actually doing, but he said it all along, no, it's okay. People got used in Russia to Putin killing for 25 years, 20 years. People got used to that. He started killing in 2004, I think, journalist in St. Petersburg. And in the beginning, was it really him? He denied it, and there was legitimate doubt. By the fifth assassination, it's okay, then there is somebody who is not Putin and who is killing every Putin enemy by coincidence. But then it was like, it's already the fifth or sixth time. Yeah, that's what he does. Know what I mean?
Yeah,
At,
then it's become too removed. It's not.
yeah,
You can't
at
even.
no point you get an alarming point.
Mhm.
And when the Second World War started with the invasion of Poland, the invasion started before the invasion of Poland, right? When Hitler annexed Austria, the population welcomed him. Not
Mhm.
everybody, but the ones who didn't make it to
There
the
wasn't a
produced
resistance.
films that conveyed the news. And then they invaded the Sudetenland, which is a part of today's Czech Republic, where Germans
Mhm.
lived. They also didn't fire a bullet. So that started normalizing things. And then they invaded Poland, which was by treaty linked with France and the United Kingdom. So both had to declare war on Germany. But then nothing happened. It was a fake war. War was declared, but nobody was shooting at the other side. And Poland was invaded from the west by Germany and from the east by Russia. Russia started the Second World War together with Germany. But of course, what they call the Great Patriotic War didn't start in 1939. That part is not in their history books. They started 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. That's when the Great Patriotic War started. That's what Russian children are taught. They are not taught
Mhm.
that their country started the Second World War as an ally of Russia, invading the same country from the other end. So,
So
but
what
when
was the tipping point, do you think, there? And does it
there
relate to
was
what could be the tipping point here in terms
there
of a
no
recognition of it?
there was no moment of great alarm.
The opposite. What because now the narrative is so different, right? If you stop there, if we just follow that thread, then it seems like we're gonna get to a point where Hitler owns the world or whatever, and, like, we are just continually accepting more but at some point, it turned the opposite way to where he became the kind of most evil human in the
Yes,
world, and
after the war.
Mhm. Yeah, but
Until the end
why
of the war, we didn't know there were concentration camps.
so it was more the physical effect of soldiers seeing that and telling the story of it and
Yeah, and then time and retrospective and the power of retroactive sight is, it's 2020. But as those events unfolded, nobody was alarmed. The reason why there were 6 million Jews killed in concentration camps is that even the Jews who Hitler was overtly saying are vermin, are the enemies within, should be cleaned up, even they didn't take that quite serious. Even after Glasnacht, the night of broken glasses, when Jewish businesses across Germany were invaded and broken, rioted, even then people thought, it's just a thing of now, it's just a thing of the moment. If we stay
Yeah.
quiet, we don't need to run away because this,
But
this
that's
will
what I mean.
fizzle
That
out.
like it's so that to what Trump was saying or to these other things that it's we can't see it and we can't accept it.
No, but,
And
but we never
you know,
do. When you are witnessing history in the making, you don't have the context that allows you to see what's actually happening. We prefer to believe in an optimistic scenario because it creates a reality for ourselves, a reality of narratives in which we do not have to take very difficult action. And so the Jews didn't need to run away because it was just a thing of the moment. It would fizzle out. The Western world went to war because at no point they really understood what was happening. When England and France, the United Kingdom and France declared war against Germany, that declaration was just in a piece of paper. Nothing happened. No shot was fired. Poland was carved in two, half for Russia, half for Germany.
that was Hitler doing something similar, right? Just going along with what everyone wants and saying yes and doing what he wants, in
Exactly.
contrary to what he said he would do.
And at every turn, people would think, yeah, this is bad, but it's not going to get worse. And then it gets a
No.
little worse. And then people say, yeah, this is bad, but it's not going to get worse. In the Second
Yeah.
World War, it only actually happened when Germany invaded the Low Countries and the north of France. And then the British Expeditionary Force was cornered at Dunkirk. And then there was the Dunkirk evacuation. Only then we realized, shit, this is actually a war. And the Germans will now try to invade England. And even at that point, the US was saying, we are not getting into the war. It's an European thing. It's not going to affect us. We are a continental country on the other side of the world. Why are we going
Mhm.
to send our youth, our young men, to die in the fields of Europe? It's not our problem. It's not going to affect us. Until, guess what? Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And could it have been prevented if people had seen the signs? Yes. But that's how history has always unfolded. We slide dreamily into war. Every time. We never say, oh, it's going to get really bad. No, we think
Mhm.
it's bad now, but it will fizzle out. And we coat it up, we put warm towels on it because it makes us feel more comfortable, because we want to focus on our lives as they are now, and get your kids education, pursue your hobby, make sure that you have enough money to retire and pay your medical bills. We don't have time and energy to start thinking about what we have to do to prevent the next world war, and that's why we slide
Mhm.
gently into that. We always did. And
Yeah, it's
that's the
only
thing.
when
I'm
it's
not
something
saying this
happens that
happened now.
disrupts your day. If you can't watch TikTok or you can't do all these things anymore or you actually see the violence, then it's
We like
disruptive
to
in the way
believe,
that's gonna
uh,
change.
yeah, Andrea, we like to believe what connects with our most basic emotional reactions. I'll give you an example of how this is done. The political system in my country, the Netherlands, is an example for the world. 16 countries, 16 parties, and they all get seats in government, more or less, and they have to do coalitions, and it's the coalition that having to understand the other side and make compromises is the blood of our political system. There is no space for extremist approaches, because even if you win the election, you will not form a government because nobody will want to govern with you, which is happening, has happened in Austria, has happened in the Netherlands. Despite that, even in a political system that's pretty good, if in the last election there is a party here that is a populist party, it's the PVV, it's an extreme right party. Geert Wilders is the blonde guy who people say is the Dutch Trump. I don't think there is any parameter of comparison. No,
No.
but I understand why people would
But
say
it's
that.
flashy in the way we were talking about. It gets your
He's
attention. He gets your attention in a
he
similar
gets
way,
your attention.
but he's not
He,
similar.
he he says things that are morally inadmissible, like taking entire so-called ethnic groups in the country and singling them out as criminal. No, that in reality is not as simple as that. And he says these things because he knows it's a hook that grabs people by their most primitive emotions
Yeah.
and mobilizes. So it give you one example of how these things are done. If you were a careful enough voter before the last Dutch election to actually read the platforms of each party puts a written platform online. That platform is then scrutinized by experts that build a website called the Stemwijzer, voting. I don't know how to translate that. It's a help for you to vote. So it asks you like 50 questions, what your position is on 50 questions, and then it will show you which political platforms are closer to your opinions. They put it in a graph with all the 16 parties, and the ones that are closest to you are highlighted, and then you can see what their platforms are. So every political party has to put those platforms in writing. What do they plan to do online? We can all access that. And I went through the trouble of reading the platform of the proposal, the document of this party. And there is one point where they say, the Netherlands is handing over dozens of our F-16 jet fighters to fight a war far away instead of defending our own country, which is what these fighters were acquired to do. We should not do this. We should use these fighters to defend our own country. Reasonable, right? And it appeals to people's emotions. Like, why am I going to make my country vulnerable in order to defend some people far away? It takes 18 hours by car for me to get to the front line, which for you guys is like it's like going to the next state.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how close it really is.
Now, what that document didn't tell you is the following. The Netherlands is a very tiny country surrounded by a bigger one, Germany. If foreign troops get to our borders, we already lost the war. So we have to prevent them from even getting to our borders by helping the countries that surround ours. Because we are so small, if foreign military is already at the border and only then we start fighting, we already lost. It's gone.
Right.
It's only 18 million people, a tiny army. And we have a limited number of airfields and limited number of fighter pilots because we are not, no, we are the size of a city. We're the size of New York, the Grand New York area. That's the Netherlands. Those fighters, those F-16s, were already in the second-hand market to be sold because we had already bought F-35s and we just don't have pilots and air bases to have the X-16s and the F-35s, nor is that militarily required. We can't have it, and even if we could, that's not how the military doctrine is put together. So we were already getting rid of those F-16s. And that's why they went to Ukraine. They wouldn't be defending Dutch borders anyway because we acquired F-35s.
But that's not said anywhere in
That's
this.
not said in that document. Now,
Right.
did they know it? Of course. Wilders has been in parliament forever, for many years. He's not stupid. He's not that impulsive either. It, I wish and I say this in a qualified way, if every ultra right wing politician were like Geert Wilders, our problems would be less. Because despite his rhetoric, he's now in government and he struck a reasonable compromise with other parties. And now the vile aspects of their program are not implemented. And he accepted that. And he's even being accused of betraying his voters because some of his voters really wanted him to do stuff that was outright racist and morally unacceptable, but he's not doing it. And he agreed to a fairly, maybe not ideal, but a fairly balanced government program.
But I've heard other people say other things too. I guess a thread through a lot of this, I wasn't here for it, but you probably know more about it. But with the football match, there's this big thing that happened in the Netherlands relative to the war.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy, right? And I've heard people say what you just said about Wilders, but I've also heard the opposite. But I think the through line that I wonder if we can look at is this us against them, or there's always an enemy, whether it's and it's usually the foreigner, right? However you want to name what that is, whichever
Or the
side you
enemy
want.
within,
What?
or the enemy within. That's how you manipulate people. You select
Within the border,
a
you
common
mean, or
enemy.
within the
Of
psyche?
course, of course, but that has always been done. In Germany, it was the Jews. The enemy is within. In
That's
the
what I mean, that's
America,
the thread, right? And that's also in the States why that was the main thing that I heard was, like I just told you about the guy in the taxi, he was mad that the immigrants had better cars than him and he was born in America, which is a kind of a story. I didn't tell you, but the guy said when he dropped him off, the guy had 4 nice cars in his driveway, so it wasn't even really true, but it's this story that the immigrants come and then they take everything that belongs to you and they're doing better than you, which is very different from the way you were presenting why we should have immigrants. But I think the thread is the us, them, you, like this, that the enemy is the reason that you're feeling bad, whatever you're feeling bad about, or the enemy is the foreigner, and that's why you're suffering. And if we just get rid of that, everything's going to be okay. This story is the story of all the things we've been talking about, isn't it? Like, how do we address this story? What's that about?
the thing about this is that rely on certain things that are true. You can lose your job to an immigrant who will accept a lower salary, and that is a problem. But then they use
But
these.
does it depend on the immigrant? I mean, it could be AI, it could be someone who has a better
It could be
job than you. Is
anything.
it
It has
always
always
so
happened.
dichotomous?
Of course, it can be a change in the industrial process that renders certain skills no longer relevant. Like you don't need to have the skills of making paper manually, like you needed to 200 years ago. So you lose your job because of that, because of an evolution of technology, because of AI, because of the immigrant, because of
But also
geopolitical.
what you were saying before, that we need people to do these kind of jobs that other people
Of
don't wanna do
course,
anymore. There's even a kind of weird
the,
judgment or elitism in that very notion that
yes,
we have to take 1,000,000 immigrants in to do all the jobs that nobody wants to do here anymore.
yeah.
Yeah.
The play is you start from facts that are real, and then you draw the absolutely wrong implication from that. That's how you are manipulated.
How do
Because
we get people to understand that's happening on a wide level, and would that change anything?
I can give you how I wish it could be done, and I can answer you based on how I think it will happen. What will happen? It goes back to the philosophy of history in Hegel. We learn through the dialectics of history. We learn by making the wrong choices and suffering the consequences. The problem is that we don't live long enough for all of that learning to be conveyed to the next generation. Things happen too fast. And the next generation largely has to relearn it again, but not to the extent of the previous one, a small percentage less. And then they pass some of that on to the generation after them, who have to relearn most of it again, but not as much as the previous. And
Yeah.
slowly, after going through this spiral multiple times, fucking up multiple times, paying the consequences for it multiple times, eventually, centuries from now, we'll be more mature. That's how it will happen. Now,
If we make it that far. I
if we
mean,
make it that far, because now there are plenty of nuclear and conventional weapons around to just end human civilization. Not the planet, not even the species. There is always the Australian Aboriginal who will survive, the African Bushman who will survive, the Northern Inuit that will survive. But civilization may end. We may end it. So if we make it that long, I think we'll learn it that way. I wish that reason can prevail through the much more extensive forms of communication and record keeping that we have now. The Second World War is still remote to us because in my youth, it was just grainy black and white images, very few audio. So it was basically words on the pages of a book, very far removed. But the
mm,
moment 100 years from now, people can watch this video in 4K with our voices, our realities, and they see, yeah, these are people just like us. They look exactly like us. They're facing issues just like us. Now, the recorded memory will have much more emotional appeal than the abstractedness of medieval paintings and drawings or even early 20th
mm.
century grainy black and white film.
Yeah, in a positive way, that dialectic, I think, that spiraling movement, actually, we are becoming what I was talking about before, this kind of blockchain is becoming more and more obvious because there's so much documentation and it's so hard to erase it. And if you really want to do the work, you can figure out what's been manipulated. And I guess that'll get easier and easier as time goes by. So maybe it will be easier to not find the whole truth because everyone's going to have a little bit of a different one, but the regularities that really happened. But this time thing is interesting, and it comes up a lot of just how do we stay motivated if it's all going to only matter, hundreds of years from now or not matter at all? Because I think that speaks to that just go with your immediate feeling and the impulsiveness that's dangerous and all of that too. Can we have some kind of paradigm shift in terms of the way we think of self too? Is there maybe there's a whole other way of living and understanding meaning and stuff that isn't stuck in these
That,
ways? Like,
that,
why do we have to always think of the foreigner and the opposite and like this theme that keeps playing out and just like killing people? And what is this? Why do we have to have this? Can't we? I don't know.
yeah,
It just feels like to accept the dialectic of that, I just wish that we could think outside. The dialectic itself could be something a little bit more regenerative, not focused on opposites. Understanding the world is not dichotomous, or maybe you think it is, but
no, I think most of it is a matter of degree. It's like saying that I am either a liberal or a conservative. I reject that
yeah,
profoundly.
you're very good at holding paradoxes. Analytic idealism is
It's
itself
not a
holding a paradox.
paradox.
Yeah.
It's not a paradox. It seems to be a paradox if you.
Well, that's the point of the paradox, right? If you hold the paradox, you actually get to what's not a paradox. So
There are certain things that are true paradoxes. If I say this sentence is not true, if it is true, then it's not true. And if it's not true, then then it's true.
exactly, but if you hold that space, then you have both things existing as they are. You don't need to decide on one or the other, and you understand that it's not an
Oh,
either/or situation, actually,
nah, I
you
think
know?
the seeming paradox between conservative and liberal is just flat out false. There is nothing paradoxical there at all. The moment you start elaborating on what these words mean, you realize that there is no conflict. It's not a paradox at all. The story that it is has been sold to you. I acknowledge that. But anybody who looks more deeply into it will see that there is no paradox. There is a party in my country called VVD. They are the liberal conservatives. And it's not a problem for any Dutch person to understand that this is not a paradox. It's just a narrative has been created in the US in which it is.
I think you're assuming that a paradox means it's irreconcilable, and I'm saying a paradox is a signal that it's already reconciled.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
not
if you
really a.
really look into what a paradox means and what Zeno and
Yeah,
everyone, it's basically alerting you to things that seem oppositional but actually aren't, which is exactly what you're saying too. So it's
yeah.
to that dialectic movement is what I'm trying to get at. Because and why I brought up why there's always an opposite and we're always fighting the foreigner that's against us. I don't know if you disagree, but it does seem like we seem in these ruts, these dualistic ruts of it's always one against the other, and we can't like understand that there's this complex nestedness going on that is actually a portal into a very much more interesting way of living and finding meaning and
Yeah,
all of that. But instead we're fighting an other that's never really an opposite, so we can
I
never
think,
resolve it.
yeah, I think both extremes in this space are to be avoided. One is to say everything is black and white, which is just not true. The other is to say everything is relative. There's nothing absolute. That's
Yeah.
just as dangerous as to say everything is black and white. You are lost in both cases because you will overlook all the subtlety and nuance that actually constitutes what we call life. And you will completely lose your ability to pass reasonable judgment, value judgments on what's going on, and therefore lose your ability to vote in a sane way. I
But to
think,
say nothing is absolute doesn't mean nothing is right or wrong. I think there's a difference. It just means that everything is always ongoing. There's no end. So how could you have an absolute, but you can have a right and a wrong still? It's just that, or do
well,
you?
I'm
Yeah.
not sure this is not contradictory what you just said. I think there are certain things that constitute what we call evil, and there is no moral relativity there. I was outraged when J.D. Vance the other day was saying, "Yeah, there's American leaders. They pick sides in the conflict in Ukraine. We shouldn't pick any side," as if the thing were relative, as if the Russian story, the Russian narrative, were as much based on morals as the Ukrainian narrative, as if you couldn't discern there who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. I think that morally irresponsible and abhorrent. One country crossed internationally recognized border lines to invade another and kill and mangle and torture and rape. The other country, the one invaded, is defending itself. No, there is no moral relativism here. There is an absolute there. One country infringed international laws and spread terror into another. This is not relative. Moral relativism is dangerous when you start using it to justify anything, because if you lose moral ground to this degree, you can no longer pass judgment. And
I
that I
guess
think is
I
as
don't think it's
dangerous.
relative. I don't think it's relative, but I also don't think it's absolute in the sense that from every position, it looks the way you just described it. Even if we could somehow understand it as that, all of us, it's going to take different kinds of ways of understanding it. So there's not going to be one absolute way in which that's going to become clear. And there's not going to be one story for why that's clear.
For,
Even within that spectrum of it being true, it's not absolute because there's going to be so many different ways in which it's going to be understood. And that doesn't mean those ways are wrong, but it does not mean that it's relative, that it's just because it could be understood from a million different ways, then therefore there's no right or wrong to it. I think that's very hard to understand that that's like a different way of thinking to understand that. Do you know what I mean? But if you just say it's absolute, then it's just, for me, you could prove me wrong. I just feel like that's playing into the same way that our language is set up so that we're always putting ourselves on one side or the other, which means we're always going to be fighting and there's always going to be like ways to say that what we're fighting for is the right thing and what they're fighting for is the wrong thing in dialogue that the other side is not going to take seriously.
I think we lose our souls on both extremes. We lose our souls when we say it's reality is too complicated, there is no solid moral ground, everything is relative. You lose our soul there. Because now you may find a justification for why a criminal can invade the house of an old retired lady and rape her for the whole night, and then slit their throat and set set the house on fire. From his point of view, because of his education and the way his genes are put together and the neurotransmitters in his brain and the abuse he suffered, and I understand that. I understand that. No,
That doesn't mean
you
it's
lost your
right,
soul.
though. That doesn't mean it's right. If you understand
Oh, correct.
why that happened, you can even say more forcefully
Correct.
why it's wrong.
Correct. Correct. We must understand evil, but we should not use this need to understand evil as an excuse for evil or an argument to say everything is too complex, everything is relative, therefore there are
Mhm.
no absolute moral judgments. I think we lose our soul there. We equally lose our souls when we portray everything as a black and white moral call without nuance. You're either liberal or conservative.
Mhm.
Now you lost all nuance. You lost any hope of a sane political discourse the moment you do that. So I
Yeah.
think in both extremes we lose our souls. We have to recognize that most things we have to make choices about are nuanced, subtle, and complex. You cannot see them as black and white. At the same time that we have to accept that there is a moral ground of absolutes. Because if we lose sight of that too, we also lose our humanity. Because now we start being able to create a narrative to justify anything. No,
Mhm.
I'll give
Well, it's
you
like the simplicity things that you brought up, right? Of the categorical imperative or the golden rule or these like very basic, would you do unto this person the way you want to have would is this how you want to be treated? It's a very simple kind of way in which you can understand right or wrong if you allow it. But that doesn't mean that understanding the narrative of how someone got to a different place and the coherence, because it's coherent. I think we confuse that coherence with it must be okay. And that's not right. But you can still
correct.
understand the coherence of the narrative and how it
Yes,
happened. And you need to, without,
yes,
because it's coherent doesn't mean it's sanctioned. Right
yes.
now, that's a very big confusion. I think even in the States where it even translates into he got elected, so he must be okay to be elected because you can understand the coherence of it. It happens all the time, but
I agree with you.
how to get that apart? The
Yeah,
coherence doesn't mean It's legit.
that
It's
it's
okay.
valid. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we have to understand evil. We have to understand why serial murderers do what they do. We have to understand why psychopaths act the way they do. We have to understand why narcissists do what they do. We have to understand, but understanding doesn't mean that it has valid moral ground. It's different than to say that because we understand, then it's also relative. It's a relative judgment call, a relative
No,
moral
I think
call.
if
It's
you really
not.
understand it, it's not relative at all.
Yeah.
It becomes much more clear that it's not relative.
Yeah. Let
Yeah.
me give you an example. It infuriates me to see discourse online about why the only way to help Ukraine is to call for talks and to sit and have a conversation with all sides. All sides have a claim, have a story, a narrative that they think is valid. So let's come together and discuss and try to solve our issues. This is a very, it's a liberal discourse that has been co-opted by the by populist demagogues.
And it's also, sorry, but it's also really doesn't understand the narrative of what's happening in Russia and Putin.
We can
Because it's
clarify.
assuming they're going to go, that's going to work. And that's not at all even
Yeah,
close to the regularities by which
even
sitting
that is
down
more
and
complex.
discussing and kind of,
It's more what you're saying is correct, but it's more complex that I want to get across. I want to get a message across through a metaphor. What
okay.
I just said is entirely equivalent to the following scenario. I'll be speaking to men now because I think this has more appeal to men since it's men that are promoting this story. You are a man and you are in your house, in your neighborhood, and you have a kid, you have a cat and a dog and your wife, and you're there in your house living your life. You're not infringing with, you're not going across the borders of your property, you're not bothering your neighbors, you're not causing any trouble. You're just there having your life in your house. And it's occasionally you talk to some friends that maybe your neighbors don't like much. They don't like those friends of yours, but you're just talking to them and it's your life. It's your freedom to do that, whether your neighbors like it or not. The point is you're not infringing with the ability of your neighbors to live the way they want. You're in your house living your life. And then a gang of criminals kicks your door down, invades your house. They rape your wife in front of you. They pour gasoline on your cat and set your cat alight just to watch your cat running desperately around and knocking against walls. Then they shoot your child and throw your child through a closed window, through the glass. And then they start setting your house on fire with you inside. And then your neighbors come and say, we should all sit together and have a conversation because the people who invade your house, they also have their point of view, they also have their grievances. And what we should do now is not to help you defend yourself, defend your loved ones, defend your property. What we should do now is to bring all of you together on a table so we can have a discussion about it. This is what it means. That's what we are saying that we should do to Ukraine. Their women are being raped, their men are being killed, their country is on fire, their pets are on fire, and we are telling them they should sit and discuss. What would happen in a society that is grounded in basic morals? What would happen is the following. We will help you kick them out and put down the fire in your house and save your loved ones. After we do that, now we will have a conversation about prosecuting crimes and preventing this from happening in the future by having a dialogue amongst all parties. In this order, that's the order in which you do this. If you don't want it to happen again and if you want to be morally grounded. And we lose sight of that because we make things more complicated than things are. We all understand what I said when it relates directly to them, their house, their loved ones, their person. But somehow, when it gets into geopolitical abstraction and nations and economies, we lose sight from basic moral grounding. And I think that is the end of us if we relativize everything, just as it is the end of us if we make everything black and white. If we do the latter, it's Third World War. If we do the former, there will be no boundaries, there will be no justice, and human life will be disastrous.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I'm glad you added that last part because it's not that sitting down and discussing it is a bad idea, but to ask in that very powerful story you just told, while that's going on and still happening, to ask people to sit down and discuss it while it continues on, maybe even in the same room that you have to watch it, but you're going to just sit down and talk about it, is more the case, and how it must feel and how insane it is, right? It's not that saying we could discuss it and try to talk
Yeah,
about it, but you're not going
yeah,
to do it while it's happening in your
yeah.
house. You're going to defend yourself.
Yeah, and Andrea, you could say not even the Biden administration was helping Ukraine as much as they should have. So everybody's in the wrong here, right? And then it comes back to a point we discussed before, which is governments not treating us as mature adults. The Biden administration was not telling us why it was playing this game of helping Ukraine just enough so Russia doesn't win, but not enough so the problem is actually solved. Why did they do that? They never explained this because they think people will not understand it. They think it's too complicated and they think it will be misused in social media. So I will tell you the story. I'll take the risk, I'll stick my neck out, and I'll tell you the story that politicians don't want to tell you. The war that is coming is against China, and it's probably going to happen before the end of this decade. And the reasons for that's a whole other discussion, and I'm not going to pass judgment on that. Uh, it's likely going to happen. Uh, the US's play is Russia is a geopolitical counterbalance to China. If Russia is weakened or unstable, China just takes over vast swaths of land in the far east of Russia, including the old Manchuria, Vladivostok, which is now a major Russian metropolis. What used to be China, they would take all that over. They have access to much more oil. Today, China imports about 80% of their energy. And they can only do that because the US Navy guarantees the safety of commercial lanes across the seas. So most of China's energy comes from the Middle East through the Strait of Oman, which is patrolled and vouchsafed by the US Navy, which is the only navy that has worldwide reach. The Chinese Navy is bigger in terms of the number of vessels, but they are all small vessels. They can't go very far. The US Navy is the only one that has worldwide reach. If China, so that's a deterrence against China, because if China tries to take the wealth and the prosperity of Taiwan, which we helped them build and steal Western technology that is in Taiwan, such as ASML lithography tools, which I worked on for 15 years and
Mm-hmm.
which we cannot send to China. If they do that, there is a very simple way to um, defeat China. You just make sure that they don't get their energy, and you can do that far away from China, and you close their ports. 50% of their food comes from abroad as well. If you close their ports, yeah, you are in a situation in which 400 million people die of starvation within 3 months. So China is deterred because of all this. If they take large swaths of Russian territory, that's a very different story. So Russia is an important counterbalance to China. That's why the Biden administration doesn't want Russia to win, because if they win, the next in line are NATO countries, like in the Baltics. And then now the US is in the fight. And they have to be in the fight because Europe is responsible as a sort of symbiotic partner for a large part of US wealth and prosperity. And all of you would feel it in your pockets very quickly if Europe falls. There is a symbiotic relationship between us. All of your semiconductors are made with Dutch technology, and that's just one example of this symbiosis. So it will be much more expensive. That's why they are in this charade now. They cannot let Russia win, but they cannot destabilize Russia because the real war is still coming. So why don't they just explain this to people? Because that's what the theory of democracy is. A government is accountable and a government reports to their boss, which is the people who voted them, the people who gave them the job, reports to their bosses, the people, why they're doing what they're doing. And you treat people like adults. And the reason why Trump wants peace at any cost with Ukraine, that's not deranged. He too is not telling you the real reason. It's because he knows the real conflict is coming with China, and we cannot afford to have Russia disintegrate into 15 different states armed with nuclear weapons, most of which have incredible natural resources that will make a war with China a lot more difficult to prevent, because what prevents war is deterrence. It's not flowers and holding hands and singing the kumbaya. That's not what prevents wars. What prevents wars is deterrence. The US has deterrence. China is trying to eliminate that by expanding their military presence in the South China Sea, Why are they doing that? Because they really think they are historically entitled to that? No, it's because if they get control over the southern China Sea, they will have control over certain commercial choke points, like
Wow.
straits that
Yeah.
go between Indonesia and Malaysia. These are narrow straits that they
Hmm.
depend on to get their food and their oil. If that is not under their control, the US can just close those lanes and then they're screwed. And that's the US deterrence. That's why they're doing what they're doing. That's the why the US is doing what it's doing. Europe is much more clear in this respect because for Europe, a rampaging mafia state like Russia, rampaging Europe, directly affects our security. And for you guys in the US, it only indirectly does so. In time, it will completely compromise your ability to have a prosperous and secure life, just like it happened in the Second World War in Japan and Pearl Harbor. Threats to the West Coast, California, Oregon, all those states were threatened. The same thing would eventually happen again, but not at first. That's why US politicians are more pragmatic in this regard than people like us here. Who are much more directly threatened. But now that there are North Korean soldiers on European territory fighting a war, now for us it's like the two conflicts are merging into one for South
Hmm.
Korea too. If these soldiers are gathering experience here, testing weapons, learning how to fight wars, it's a threat to them. So the South Koreans are now going to Ukraine. That's how world wars are constructed, one step at a time. This is why this stuff is happening. But the governments, either side in the US, there are only two sides, not 16 as here, but governments, either side there, they are not telling you the whole story. They are both busy at figuring out what's the best way at manipulating you. And right now, the best manipulators are the ones who won. Previously, the best manipulators were the liberal Democrats. That's how politics is done because politicians do what works, not what is right.
That's
And you can't
powerful.
blame
That's
them for that.
powerful. What you just laid out is very powerful. And even knowing all that, I'm gonna have to think through it a bit more because a few of those things I really hadn't made those connections. And but knowing all that, you're very passionate about Ukraine is because it's just wrong, right? Where is that coming from for you? Even if you understand all those dynamics and what could happen, and like where is it back to the good and evil and knowing which side you want to be on? And second to that, I wonder if someone asked you to come on and be, maybe they even have, a consultant or like work with the government and try to help on these problems, do you think there's a way you could say yes and help, or is it that the whole thing is just like you can't possibly enter into it and do any kind of helpful thing? Or I guess more in the States too, not necessarily in the Netherlands, but
Oh no, in the States, I'm not a U.S. citizen, so
I
no, I
know,
should
but I'm
not be a
saying, you
consultant.
know.
No, yeah, there is a way I could possibly say yes. I'll leave it at that. Um, um, for me, in Ukraine, it's first and foremost a moral issue. No, a gang of criminals has entered somebody's house, raped somebody's wife, set somebody's cat on fire, killed
Mhm.
somebody's child. And in my mind, that moral issue has overwhelming precedence over everything else. But I still have pragmatic reasons for why this should be stopped. In this day and age, if a state consolidates a gain by infringing international law, the precedence that this creates is devastating because it will tell
Mhm.
other potentially rogue states that this may pay off, this may work, that it may pay off to invade another country, kill, pillage, destroy, and rape, get away with it, and still have a profit. So I think it's very important that this precedent not be created and that moral relativism and geopolitical pragmatism does not get in the way of preventing this precedent from being created because it starts a domino process. If it works once, that's the lesson it teaches rogue states, and they will do it again. And if it pays off again, they do it again until one day that wave knocks at your front door. And even if it doesn't knock at your front door, human decency should still bring us into action, even if we don't get directly involved. For me, that's the key point. That said, I understand the Biden administration's tightrope balancing act. help enough so they don't lose, so Russia doesn't
Mm.
win, so we don't create that precedence, but don't help so much that you destabilize Russia. I think morally, morals are not for this tightrope balancing act. I think morality tells us we have to get those criminals out of my neighbor's house as soon as possible. And
Mm.
before more rape, before more killing, before more suffering. And then we sit together and see what to do about preventing it in the future. That's not what they are doing because they're being geopolitically pragmatic, just like J.D. Vance and Trump are geopolitically pragmatic about the real
Mm.
conflict being elsewhere. I think that is morally reprehensible, but I understand it. I don't think it's right, but I understand it. And I
But you don't
understand.
see it's a trolley problem, I think. You don't.
No, it is a trolley problem.
Is it?
It
Okay.
is a trolley problem.
So either way, it's because even if we do what you want us to do, if exactly, then there are going to be repercussions that create more of that possibly in other
I
places.
recognize that if we help Ukraine to the point where we get the criminals out of their house, that would be profoundly destabilizing to the Russian government, which is a mafia government. So I don't mind if that government collapses because it's a
Mhm.
mafia state. But I recognize that destabilizing the current government in Russia will not produce a follow up government that is stable. It will probably break the country up or prevent them from have from being a counterweight to China's presence in the Far East, and that could complicate the situation when it comes to preventing a war with China through deterrence, and create a much bigger problem that may lead to even more suffering, more catastrophe. It may even lead to a limited scale nuclear war. I don't think there will be a full scale nuclear war, but a limited scale nuclear war could happen, which would be catastrophic for many countless millions of people. So I recognize that it is a trolley problem, but I have moral imperatives that seem to overwhelm my thinking in that regard. When I see my neighbor's house on fire and criminals inside raping and pillaging and torturing and setting them on fire, my sole moral imperative is to stop the carnage first and then think about the rest later. But I recognize I may be the one who chooses the train to kill one person by changing the tracks. And
I think we can just find some way to change the complete trolley thing at some point. Like, get out of these. That too is that dichotomy that I feel like we need to lift out of. But nonetheless, every action has some repercussions, and I definitely can hear people in different countries that I know sometimes listen to this saying, "We have this in our country too. Can you help us?" Because this people are treating people badly in a lot of places, and yeah, it just gets there's trolleys everywhere. And but we could get into that, but there's a layer here which we haven't talked about, which is the kind of close to you too, the way that technology is changing this, and that the layer of algorithmic war or change. And of course, now a lot of this isn't in the hands only of nation states and countries. Some of it's in the hands of individuals who own satellites in space and things that can change stuff. So I wonder if you've thought about that much too, or if you see this as a like a shift in power dynamics on that level too, of where a lot of what we're talking about now depends on power being in traditional places. But if we think of it algorithmically and in terms of technology, that's changing too on different levels. Even on the level of, I think this election in the United States was heavily influenced by podcasts, you know,
yeah,
by who did or did not go on this or that podcast, and by which particular kind of personality is swaying popular
yeah,
sentiment.
this is not new. Maybe
Yeah.
it's Joe Rogan now, but it used to be Walter Cronkite a few decades ago. Instead of the eight
But
o'clock
Walter
news, you had
Cronkite, both parties would have went on. In Joe Rogan, there was a kind of feeling that, oh, we can't go on. We can't. I'm going back to when Bernie Sanders. Remember when Bernie Sanders was on Joe Rogan, and it was wonderful. And Joe Rogan even, I think, was like, oh, I like this guy, and probably was going to even endorse him or did. And everyone on the left was like so mad. Not everyone, but a lot of people were so mad that Bernie went on Joe Rogan. You know, because you're not supposed to cross the line and go over to that macho side, and that trend played itself out to where we are now. I'm making it
yeah.
cartoonish, but it's that dichotomy again of I don't think that was true with Walter Cronkite. Maybe it was. I don't know.
I think it was.
Yeah,
I
really?
think
Okay.
I think subtle manipulation was enough then. Now it's not enough anymore, so things are much more visible. But I think media organizations have always either openly or secretly endorsed certain political streams and not others, and worked towards one thing and not another.
But this is
Um,
the reverse of that. It's not Joe Rogan endorsing, it's the party itself not wanting to be aligned with that kind of a thing. So it would be
well, that
like
I understand
yeah,
too. I've made the
yeah.
same choice.
Is that also always been around, or
I
would
think
someone have
so.
chosen not to go on Walter Cronkite because it was too left or right leaning?
Well,
Because
there
I
was a
think that's the
time.
reason a lot of people didn't engage with this sort of side of Joe Rogan, which also extends to people like Peterson, and there's a whole kind of way in which there's not a lot of nuance there because of the macho-ness or because
Yeah.
of how visceral the reactions can be for certain people. And I'm not saying one way is right or wrong. Completely understand it, but it just feels like something's a little bit different there, but maybe not. Maybe it's just amplified
No, there
of
is a difference. There is
yeah.
a real problem. There is a book that talks about it. I forgot the name of the author. The problem is called techno-feudalism, in which,
Techno-feudalism?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, in
okay.
which
I write it down.
major technology organizations, media organizations, which are now merged with technology organizations, they may exert the powers of state.
Mm,
They may have power commensurable with the powers that only the state should have, because in a democracy the powers of state are given by the people, but in techno-feudalism those powers are garnered in a different way, not through vote. That's why feudalism. But they end up defining the future or the path of nations as much as powers of government. And that's an
mm,
issue. For democracy to survive, technical feudalism has to be combated. You cannot have one person sitting on top of companies that are so powerful that they can do their own foreign policy or
mm,
take decisions that only states should decide in democracies, because nobody voted for them in an election. They just got lucky or were good in business. That doesn't mean that they should have powers of state. So that's an issue. That's a real problem. And I think we should, our legislative power should pass laws that prevent the accumulation of that kind of power beyond a certain level. And people would say, oh, it's socialism. It's all a matter of degree. There is a point where you have to say individuals cannot become more powerful than their states, because at that point you no longer have a
mm,
democracy. At that point you have an autocracy, or maybe even a meritocracy, which sounds nice, but it's still not democratic, because you may have risen the ranks in the corporate world through merit, but not the kind of merit that would give you democratic powers. In other words, you may not have worked in the interest of the people, but solely in the interest of shareholders. And that's fine if you're a corporate leader, but that shouldn't grant you powers of state, because the process of getting those powers are very different based on different values, different criteria, and they shouldn't be mixed. So there is a case to be made against wealth beyond a certain level and against powers that are comparable to the powers of the state as far as defining the directions of the country inside and also in terms of foreign policy. There is a case to be made that we should legislate that risk away. And I would support that if the effort is made. Of course, in the US, that effort will not be made, at least during the next 4 years. But maybe in Europe, something can be done in that regard. And maybe something can be done even in the US in the future further away. But I do not conflate what I just said, Andrea, with media personalities having sway, because I think that has always been the case. It's just that there was a time in which the manipulation was so subtle that we thought they were not biased, but they were. And that's the most dangerous bias, is when you are being manipulated in a certain direction and you don't even see that's what's happening. I rather have Joe Rogan say, maybe too late, but he did say at some point, I endorse Trump.
mhm.
If that was already the path which he was following in a very subtle way, appealing to young men, I rather have that be open and
Yeah, yeah.
overt.
Just
So
to
we
be
all
clear,
know.
I wasn't criticizing Joe Rogan because I think Joe Rogan is doing what Joe Rogan is and does, and that's, you can have your opinion on that. But I was more thinking about, again, I'm thinking through these beyond dichotomy and trying to get, but it just, that railroad rutting that I was talking about has become so powerful that I feel like there's something about Joe Rogan and that side, that, and Jordan Peterson and all these people who identifies in a, is familiar to a huge section of the voting population. And you said we should take grievances seriously, and I think that means taking that seriously. That's happening. It's been happening, and that's something about that isn't recognized in a way that isn't reactive. And I'm talking even to myself, because I remember when all this stuff happened with Jordan Peterson and the woman, and it's visceral, and it's, you feel like you have to take a side rather than somehow look at this differently. And yeah, it just became, I think it seems like it accelerated whatever all of that was towards becoming more of itself, and less of a dialogue, less of what's the real grievances and how do we talk about it, and more, you can't possibly associate yourself with that because it's fascist or something like this, which is just doesn't make a lot of sense, I think.
I prefer a world in which media organizations explicitly endorse, or the opposite, political candidates, and provide a rationale for why they are doing it. Like the New York Times has always endorsed certain candidates and provided an editorial in which they explain why. Scientific American endorsed Kamala Harris in the last election cycle, and they provided a long editorial explaining why. So did The Economist. I prefer that to a world in which media organizations manipulate implicitly through reporting bias and pretend that they don't really have a position, pretend that they are neutral, while their editorial decisions are clearly, or maybe less clearly, but effectively biasing the population one way or the other. I prefer a world in which opinions are made clear and they are all overtly on the table, so we can judge people accordingly. I chose to not go to the Joe Rogan podcast if I'm invited again. I made the choice. I think Joe Rogan had the right to endorse. I think it is correct that he made that endorsement explicit instead of through hidden manipulation. But it's also an endorsement that, for me, is morally reprehensible. And I do not want to associate myself with where that kind of movement is going. Look,
Mm.
the summary of my position is the following: the grievances are legitimate, but the reaction to the grievances are going to exacerbate the problem that led to the grievance in the first place, as opposed to solving it. That's the problem. And that reaction not only exacerbates the problem, I think it's morally reprehensible, because it does away with this very clear moral foundation that is not subtle, is not relative, it's not complicated. It's just plain human decency and an appreciation for truth, truth as a value. And that's
I
why
think
I
that's
choose.
wonderful, but not but. Bernardo, that's so important what you're saying, that to me, maybe I'm being idealistic, but if you, it sounds like you were invited to be on Joe Rogan and you said no, and that, I completely respect that. But what if that audience could have heard you say that and they haven't heard that from anyone else? Or because Bernie Sanders was a big hit on that show and changed a lot of, I remember someone in my family who's definitely not, didn't vote the same way as I, wanted to vote for Bernie after that. Should
I
we
didn't
put
say,
each other, so you, because I'm this way I should only talk to the New York Times or this, or, because it's very tricky, because maybe if you went on that show then it seems like you endorse what he's saying, but the
no,
people who
that's
would
not the
listen to it
reason.
would know you don't. And I don't know, I just, am I
I'll
being too
explain to you.
idealistic to think? Yeah.
I'll explain to you. No, I didn't
Okay.
say no to Joe Rogan. I did get an invitation years ago, and my reaction was not yet when I go
Okay.
to the US again. And then I went to the US again, and I didn't contact him. So it was we left it open, and I never said a direct
Okay.
no
I see.
to him. So that's where I was coming from. Today, I'll not say anything. But if I get an invitation today, I would say, okay, this time it's an explicit no. I don't want to do that. Now, why do I not want to do that? This will sound precious in this day and age. Um, I want to reach people who will take my philosophical story seriously for the right reasons. I do not want to reach people who will almost certainly take me seriously or even believing me outright for the wrong reasons. And in this day and age, people just want to be heard and taken seriously, right? And there is something in me. I do not want to reach people who will believe me for the wrong reasons. I actively do not want that to happen. And I've suspected, I will not say I knew, who am I to know anything? I suspected that in the Joe Rogan podcast, I would be believed for the wrong reasons.
What would
Namely,
that be? Can you tell me what a wrong reason would
yeah,
be?
as your audience may know, because it's not the first time we talk about it, I am an idealist philosopher. I think there is an external real world, but it's mental. And I think materiality is not a thing, it's a representation. It's the way we represent the things we perceive, but the things in themselves are mental processes. The whole world is mental. There is no materiality at the foundational level of nature. This is a very anti mainstream position. Not anti mainstream, but it contradicts the mainstream, which tells us the opposite. It is matter that really exists, and mind is just a representation that arises within material constructs. It's just a sort of a digest of material activity in the brain. That's what we call mind. That's what Daniel Dennett used to say, a materialist philosopher who died not long ago. So the whole thing about my philosophy carries this, or maybe perceived as carrying this rebellious attitude against elites, against the mainstream, something that will stick up to the man, who will put the elites in their place. Or even because it's a philosophy that tells everything is mind, it may be construed as a philosophy that denies absolute truths. It's a philosophy that foments the thought that no, everything is relative. It's my reality. You are in your reality, I have mine. Truth doesn't exist or doesn't matter. It may be construed that way. In fact, it doesn't say that at all. It's a philosophy that says there are real facts. They are mental, but they don't depend on my or your mentation. They are mentation out there. Even if you were not here, they would still be where they are. These are real, objective facts. There is such a thing as truth and such a
Mhm.
thing as falsity or lies. No, they are not relative. But I suspect that my philosophy would be appreciated under certain political currents of thought, certain social currents of thought and feeling that would play into these things that I do not support. I do not support relativizing reality. I do not support post truth. I do not support relativizing morals. I do not support being anti-mainstream for the sake of being anti-mainstream. I think mainstream materialism is false because it's materialism, not because it's mainstream. If the mainstream is reasonable, I'm all for the mainstream. I am for reason, not against the mainstream. I'm simply for reason. Um, so I judged at the time, and my judgment is stronger now, that it's dangerous to reach people who will believe you for the wrong reasons, because the effects of that belief will be the opposite of what I'm trying to achieve. In
Hmm.
other words, there will be a wave of misunderstanding that will snowball and create a monster of my own making that doesn't represent what my philosophy is all about, is not consistent with my philosophy. So for me,
Hmm.
it's important to know how to reach people and to reach the right people. I've never convinced anybody of anything. Everything that has happened so far is people who already know or think that my philosophy is true. When they read my philosophy, it gives them the words, it gives them the
Hmm.
conceptual apparatus that confirms what they already knew within. I never convinced anybody of something they didn't already know intuitively within. So those are the people I'm trying to reach, because the effect of reaching the wrong people who will believe me for the wrong reasons, and I'm not blaming them for that. It's just normal human stuff, human dynamics. But because I understand it, I carry the moral responsibility to at least try to prevent it. And therefore, to try to the extent that I can make that judgment to not reach the people who will believe me for the wrong reasons.
Wow, that's really a strong thing to say. And it actually puts a lot in perspective of what we've been talking about, because it's not that spirit of just do what's going to get you the most attention
or money by selling
or
books.
money, or it's really thinking through it. And I don't know, for some reason it makes me wonder. First of all, I want to say congratulations on Analytic Idealism in a nutshell.
Thank
Very
you.
cool. And you put it so clearly in the beginning, what you just said, which I think is very important because, yeah, it's like, this is what it is if you're going to go any further. Anyway, it's really great. And, but as you were talking, I was wondering, was there ever a time in your life you might have gone on, gone that way of wanting just going with the inertia of attention and, maybe even that you would have voted more towards that? Or have you always, I don't know. Was there ever a time you might have thought differently about this in a radical way, a way that I won't say you would vote for Trump, but closer to that?
I
The
voted
angry,
VVD in the
yeah.
Netherlands a couple of times, the liberal conservatives. No, I don't think there was a time in my life in which I would have voted for populism. Populism and post-truth is the antithesis of what I stand for. I stand for truth. Analytic idealism stands for getting closer to truth, for reforming mistakes once they become clear, not for denying truth or relativizing everything or outright and deliberately manipulate people. That's not what I stand for, and I never stood for it. So no, I don't think there ever was a time in my life in which I would have been susceptible to that temptation. It's not even a temptation for me. I would not say that there was never a time in my life in which I wouldn't have done something just to sell more books, because in the early days, this whole philosophy thing is not something I ever planned. I was happy in the corporate world, climbing the career ladder, helping produce amazing technology that fulfilled me. It's what I wanted to do as a kid. It's what I was doing. It's what Bernardo Castro was and is still all about. This philosophy thing happened to me, parachuted into my life out of some place in my inner mind that I didn't even know existed. It's like an
Hmm.
imposition. It, it's a
Is it a
distraction.
Daemon kind of connection, or is it connected to the Daemon?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I call it because it
yeah.
doesn't seem like it's me. It's something that is imposed on me. And there was a time in
But
which
isn't that
my
more you in a way too than
it's
that
not
other?
Bernardo Kastrup. No, it may be
But
more
that's
my
what I
real self.
mean. The without the, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Maybe that's what people refer to when they say your true self. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but it's
It's
not
the
Bernardo.
true self doesn't need the self. But anyway, sorry, that was
Perhaps
another
it's
tangent.
not Bernardo. It's not the thing I identify
It's
with
not
as
the
a
narrative
person.
of you that, yeah.
Yeah. So in the beginning, when these first 5 years, when this was imposed on me, my inner attitude was the following: I need to do this as fast as possible.
Mm,
No, burn this through as fast as possible. Get to whatever I need to get. Achieve whatever objective it thinks it needs to achieve, so I
mm.
can free myself from it as
Oh,
quickly as
wow.
possible.
Ha!
So
You didn't want it anymore.
I wanted to get rid of it as soon as possible.
Oh,
So
wow.
if the way to get rid of it was to have a international bestseller and settle the metaphysical question for humanity so I could go back and work with electronics, then I would have done that,
That's hilarious.
because that's how I felt. Today, I have accepted that this will always be a theme of my life. There is no freedom from it. It will
Yeah.
always be there, and I am in
It's not
peace.
gonna
But
go away, Bernardo.
yeah, so I'm not in a hurry to get rid of it anymore. So I'm more thoughtful. I am less stupid. But there was a time in the first 5 years in which I don't know whether I would have gone to any podcast or do whatever against my moral judgments. I don't know whether I would have that, but I could. Maybe
Mm.
I wouldn't, but as far as I know today, looking back, I can't guarantee that I wouldn't.
But you can get a little bit of a sense of how people in the moment make those little choices of just do whatever is most expedient. You can understand how that might start that inertia, and then
And
I
that,
don't, yeah.
yeah, I know, I understand that it's very important, or at least very tempting, attractive for most people to grow their egos, become rich and famous, as you guys say in the US, like rich and famous, as if they were the same thing. They're completely different things, right? Don't know why they come together. Why do you need to be famous? It provides some kind of egoic validation. I understand this. I am personally a natural introvert. I am an extrovert by adaptation.
Mm.
I am a natural introvert. I personally do not feel any need to get tremendous public credit or be exalted as a differentiated human being who is great or whatever. To be very honest with you, I this I find this very uncomfortable. I find being flattered very uncomfortable. I know I cannot act upon that discomfort because people will think it's arrogant. If I
Mm.
go and give a public talk and then people come to me and say, "You're great, your philosophy changed my life,"
You said,
I
please
would
don't say that.
smile and I would thank them for sharing that with me, and I would sign the books they bought. I would play the role because I know I would be misunderstood otherwise. But to me, that's the worst part of any public event is
Mm.
being flattered afterwards. It makes me uncomfortable. Now, people listening to this, you don't need to feel guilty if you ever flattered me. I'm a grown-up man. I'm 50. I can deal with it. Then no
Happy birthday,
problem.
by the
I'm
way.
not hurt. No, I'm not feeling bad. But I never had, to finally answer your question, I never had that motivation of doing something because it would flatter me or make me famous. This is foreign waters for me. I know it exists. I know it's part of what being human means because most of people seem to have it, but
Mhm.
it's not something I can personally relate to very much. My
You
first book,
never struggled with ego? I mean, I get, and then I know
yeah,
those
but
are different things, but
of course I
because a
did.
lot of this, the root of it is pretty simple to go back to what you were saying at the beginning about there's simple answers and there's also simple
Yeah.
troubles with this. A lot of it is wanting attention, wanting love, wanting power, feeling not wanting confidence. I think it's very much true that the people who are the strongest and the most powerful and the most confident, we rarely see that much unless they're forced to, unless they have to take on the role, maybe in a way that you're describing where you just like it's not that they went out and were seeking it in the way that we associate with those things. Because really when you're most confident and powerful, you don't need to seek it. And seeking it is going against kind of whatever that Daemon spirit is. But that doesn't mean we don't have, like, ego issues, right?
Oh, I of course I
Yeah.
struggled with ego.
Okay.
I don't take well to being disrespected, and that's a reflection of there being an ego in me. Otherwise, who is there to be disrespected, right? It would just not matter. But I don't take well to this day, less now, but especially when I was younger and I was climbing the ladder in the corporate world very early. I was 33 years old. I was promoted to senior management, which in most US companies would be a vice president position.
Was
I
that at
didn't,
CERN, or where were you then? Were you at
I
CERN?
was at ASML.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
it.
so you were already so successful that yeah, anyway, I'll
Well,
let
but
you continue. Okay, so
still, I didn't take well to being disrespected.
what was disrespect for you? Was it similar to what bothers you about what's happening in Ukraine? Was it some kind of inhumanity or something? Or it seems connected to the reason you don't like to be flattered
There
in a
was
similar way.
once we were having a meeting with a customer and somebody contradicted what I had just said. That was an issue. That became a problem. I escalated it. That became a problem. And I addressed it in pragmatic language. It didn't help us get that customer. But truthfully, if I'm honest to you and myself, it bruised my ego.
Mm.
I took that as disrespect. Or if somebody is bringing their dogs, walk in front of my house and lets their dog poop in my front yard. Oh, I can react explosively to that. There is, I have an ego in that sense, obviously. Obviously to me, right? Knowing that I have those experiences, I know I have an ego, but it has never been an ego that sought fame, visibility. Fame and
Mm.
visibility tend to make me rather uncomfortable. When I wrote my first book, I wanted to write it under a pseudonym. But because I didn't have a platform back then, my publisher said, look, we believe in your book, but you're a starting author. If you're going to start what is already a very difficult journey to market your material, if you're going to start that already under the veil of a pseudonym, it will make it so difficult to market your book because you can't give an interview like we are having right now unless I wear a mask, and you can't do a public event. And they said, no, if you want us to publish, you have to put your name. And I agreed with that. But my original tendency was I don't even want to be known as the author. And if it would
You
be an
don't wanna be
unsuccessful,
seen. You'd rather not be visible
yeah,
or something like that.
yeah, I am. I know I'm keenly aware that I am just the carrier of something that doesn't
Yeah, I was
come
about to
from me.
say, if it's really what's moving through you, though, you can separate those things, but
Yeah, but and I do. but
You've come to figure that out, I
my
guess.
face still has to be there
Yeah, yeah, I know.
because I'm the carrier of the thing.
Mm,
And no, I never had the temptation to do the talk circuit or the podcast circuit in order to be famous or in order to sell my books. I was never financially dependent on selling books. Thank goodness, financially and have been okay for a while. So I don't have that concern. And I
mm.
also don't have great material ambitions, meaning if I had $100 million in my bank account tomorrow, very little would change in my life. I would still be using an 8-year-old
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
iPhone XE from 2016. I would still be driving my Volkswagen Passat from 2014, 10 years old. I probably would still be living in my house, which is a nice house. It's a freestanding house. For Dutch standards, it's a pretty high level house.
Yeah.
For American standards, it would be an average house. It's made of bricks, not of wood, but
Oh, wow.
in terms of size, it would be an average house with an average backyard. So very little would change. So I don't even have the motivation to be rich, let alone be famous. I wouldn't mind a little more money to guarantee a better pension than I would have if tomorrow I didn't have an income anymore. I could make it, but not as comfortably as I would like. So I wouldn't mind a little more money, but I wouldn't know what to do with a lot of extra money. And I don't feel
Mm,
comfortable with a lot of fame either. That
mm,
to whatever small degree I am known publicly today, that already makes me uncomfortable, especially now
mm.
that I'm becoming better known in the Netherlands. In the beginning, it was good because I was known in the UK and in the US, and I was living in the Netherlands. So nobody would recognize me in a restaurant. The other day, I was eating in a very nice restaurant in Eindhoven, and it's a very small restaurant. It's a Michelin 2-star restaurant, so only a
Oh,
couple of tables. So everybody who's there
wow.
sees whoever else was in there, and I was there quietly having my once a year very nice meal, one of the few indulgences I give myself is once a year a very nice meal.
Was it for your birthday? Wasn't your birthday
It was
recently?
my partner's birthday,
Oh,
my
okay. It
girlfriend's
was for a
birthday,
birthday.
and the one
Happy
table.
birthday to your partner, by the way.
Yeah, that was several months ago.
A while ago. Okay.
But then it was the first time it happened to me in the Netherlands that I was not even in a public event in the Netherlands. It was just, I was in a restaurant, a pretty exclusive restaurant. There aren't many people there. And
Hmm.
at the end of my dinner, the people in the next table, who probably recognized me the moment they entered, I was already sitting there, and they said, "You're Bernardo Kastrup. We very much appreciate your work." And I was like, I was happy that
Yeah,
they
that's nice.
appreciated
That's a
my
nice thing to
work.
say.
It's
It's
a
yeah.
nice thing to say, and I'm
Hmm.
happy that my work has had a positive impact.
Yeah.
But there was another thing in me. Oh shit! This is the beginning of
Starting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
much appreciate being
And then in
just one more of
anonymous.
us. I find it
I
so
really
comforting.
understand you. I mean,
Yeah,
I was around fame really early, and it scared me. It really scared me to see, uh, first of all, how lost people could get by it and trying to keep it, even though the people around me weren't like that. They were very grounded, but you're in that world and it just felt weird. But also what you're saying that I've always had trouble even, it's hard to be seen. Like, I don't like people looking at me. And that feeling of if you're going to go out in your neighborhood and people like, you can't go anywhere without being recognized, it's weird.
yeah,
But lately, I've thought maybe there's something wrong with that, and it connects to your Daemon thing and letting things flow through you, and I've started to feel like maybe I was taking myself a little too seriously to be so concerned, but then I don't know, because privacy and being sane are very connected to me for me too, so
yeah. For me, I've spent a long time thinking about why I am like this because most people
mhm.
don't seem to be like this. They don't have a
No,
problem
it's
with
almost
it.
the
So
opposite. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm like, why do I have this problem? So I spent years thinking about it, and the conclusion I arrived at so far, I may change my mind as we go forward, but
Yeah.
the threat I sense is to be robbed of my humanity. Because when you're just a normal person, there is no question of your humanity. You're just one of the gang. You're one more person on the streets, one more
Yeah.
person, having to make ends meet at the end of the month. You're as human and as fallible as everybody else, as susceptible to failure and to error, to mistake, as everybody else. And that I find extremely soothing because
Mhm.
it doesn't place a heavy weight of moral responsibility on your shoulders. You carry the same weight everybody else carries, and you are within that web of human mutual reassurance. When
Mhm.
you suffer, the other people who suffer console you. And the year later, you are one of the people who are suffering and console another sufferer. So you
Mhm.
are surrounded by your own kind. That's reassuring, comforting, and when people start looking up to you, they it's not. I don't say that they do that maliciously. It's not what they are trying to do, but the effect is that kicking you upstairs.
Mhm.
I experience it as being robbed of my humanity and being invested with a weight of responsibility that is incommensurable with my fallibility as a human being. And that's what makes me uncomfortable. This elevation, this exiling me, this like kicking me away from the web of mutual human reassurance, from the
So you
web.
feel like they're distancing you from
Yeah,
what you need, which is just to
yeah,
be connected to humanity.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I am fiercely connected to my humanity. And
Yeah.
I will instinctively and emotionally react to false but perceived threats to my humanity. And being elevated as the wise philosopher, the one people want to listen to, that's a huge threat to my
Mm.
humanity. The
Is it a
service
threat
what
if you
I'm.
don't take it seriously? I mean, if you are you worried you'll start believing it? No. It's just
No,
that you can't connect anymore because people aren't seeing you, they're seeing
no, I
this
can. I
image.
can connect. The fear is they can't. They will not treat me as a
They're
normal
not
human
connecting to who
being.
you really are, or
Precisely.
yeah. They're seeing an image of you.
Precisely. They are seeing their own projections. And I went to the point of discussing this with a therapist. And he'll probably be listening to this, and because I
Yeah.
talked about this before. But this got to a point where I started actively trying to prevent projections by
Hmm.
exaggerating on my fallibility, by exaggerating on all the ways in which I'm playing human, and
So
sort of,
by talking about your weaknesses or
yeah,
something, or how to yeah.
yeah,
You mean publicly or in books
yeah.
or yeah.
Yeah, I've exaggerated certain things. Oh, please, guys, the audience, don't start going scrutinizing all my previous interviews. It's subtle stuff. It's not obvious. But
Yeah,
I
I'm
know,
starting I see a little bit, but you write in so many different voices. I don't
well,
mean
even
they're the
verbally,
same
right?
voice, but you can be academic, you can be conversational,
Yeah,
you yeah.
yeah. But this therapist told me, Bernardo, the more you try to go against people's tendency to project on you, the worse you make. Because now, oh, look how modest he is. He's the real deal. He's the real master. You know what I mean? It backfires.
That's so true, yeah.
And so he
You have to
convinced
be
me.
an arrogant jerk if you really want people to treat you the right way. That's
Yeah.
terrible, though, that goes against everything we've been saying this whole conversation, so
Yeah, no,
I
that
take
goes
that
too
back.
much against my nature. I couldn't play
Don't be an
that
arrogant
role.
jerk.
I'm not good enough an actor.
But look, it reminds me
So,
of something I remember reading in spiritual traditions when I was like a kid about I don't know if it was Jesus or the Buddha, or I was always trying to understand these things. And one of the stories was like, I don't remember. I'm sorry, everyone who knows this, but some spiritual figure says in some text that the closer you get to being present or being enlightened or whatever the terminology is in whatever text I'm talking about, the more solitary you are
yeah,
or the more lonely you are. Lonely isn't the right word, but something similar to what you're saying, I think, in terms of not feeling as connected even though you're 100% connected.
yeah, I heard this. I don't have that
Yeah.
problem because I'm not enlightened, but uh, but I
No,
heard
but do you
this.
I guess what there's something I mean, I've heard it also in academia or in philosophy where I think it comes back around, I guess is what I'm saying, because I don't really think that's true what I just said. I think it's true for a while, because you start to it's almost like what we were talking about with the people who are doing the propaganda, understanding the way things work more than the people around them, and so there's a kind of like a power thing, and it might seem like that at first when you delve into philosophy or text because you seem to be getting some information that others don't have, or it seems to be separating you, But then the further you go into it, it becomes the opposite of that. Like you don't understand anything actually, even though you can understand all these patterns. And even though you have peace, I guess that's what I try to talk about with holding the paradox, but actually you become more connected. I wonder if maybe you're going through that process in a completely different way, but so that it might not be that people can rob you of your humanity in a way.
Oh
I don't
no,
know.
they can't, but they
Right.
can treat me as
As if
if
they're
I weren't
trying to?
human, and that's my problem. I don't think they will actually rob me of my humanity. No,
Okay.
I cannot be anything else. It's what I am. They will not change what I am. But
But your
they can.
feeling is what bothers you, that you feel
I
like you're
don't.
not.
I don't want to be treated as different.
Yeah. But you are, Bernardo. We all are. You're
Oh,
giving
well, I'm
something
unique
different,
in the
you know?
sense that everybody is unique, but
Yeah.
that's why we are the same. We are the same in our uniqueness. I don't want
Yeah.
to be treated as if I were, in some sense, more or especially unique,
Mhm.
or as if I had a higher capability of something. Look, m- I am meta conscious enough, I'm self conscious enough to know how things can go wrong in here.
Yeah,
To know
yeah.
I know I can't hide from myself my own bullshit,
Yeah, you're
right?
doing a lot of checks and balances on yourself.
It's all like, how can I pretend that I don't err and I don't bullshit myself sometimes? That sometimes I
Right.
don't react emotionally in an unfair way.
I mean,
I,
for me, that would be the thing I would feel if I were you, that I wouldn't want people to assume that I don't have all that stuff because I'm gonna show you that I do because I'm human. And also there's something scary about it. I mean, I've been in a few situations where people treat me in a certain way, and there's something almost like sleepwalking-ish about it. And I don't mean the people who are doing it, but if you participate in it, it becomes almost like a trance or something because it's not really reality. There's something weird about it. Do you know what I mean? Almost uncanny or something.
well, I don't really have that problem in the sense that none of it convinces me that I am other than the human I am.
Yeah, why not?
I just don't want to be treated as if I were otherwise. That's what makes me uncomfortable. But I'm very much in touch with my humanity. I have, when I was in the corporate world, it was one of the reasons I didn't want to leave. I resisted for so long to leaving and starting Essential Foundation, although people were asking me to do that for 5 years before I actually did it. At work,
It's
as one
amazing
of
how
the
life
gang.
just gives you your path, like, almost forces you on your
Yeah,
path.
absolutely. Absolutely. My next year's book will talk about it.
Okay.
But at work, the culture at the SML was a culture of mutual criticism. Like we kept each other sharp. We were always looking
That's
for
good.
how we were deluding ourselves. What were
Mm,
we not seeing? What were
that's
were
great.
we
That sounds very
believing?
healthy.
Yeah. So we always poked each other, and I loved that culture because it kept me very grounded. And
Mm,
nobody looked up to me, even when I became boss and all that stuff. At the SML, maybe you have a higher management position, but that doesn't mean that you're better. It only means that you have a certain number of responsibilities that others don't have. You're one of the
mm,
gang that happens to have management responsibilities. That's all.
mm.
Board
I like
meetings
that
at
way of
the
putting it.
SML,
That's good. Yeah.
if an issue would come up in a board meeting at the SML that was very technical, and
Hmm.
the person who knew about that issue was the lowest level engineer, the CEO of the company would pick up the phone during the board meeting, call that person and say, come up. And that person would take part in the board meeting.
That's
So
great.
nobody was better.
Yeah, just different skills or
Everybody
different.
had a role to play, and that was
Yeah.
it. And that was very grounding. And I had that for 15 years,
Oh,
and
I
I
like
didn't
that a
want to
lot.
lose that. So now in the foundation, because it's a foundation around philosophy and it touches on spirituality, even though we are not a spiritual foundation. Philosophy always touches on the great questions of meaning and
Yeah.
beings, it touches on spirituality. So I'm much more vulnerable to being treated in this
Mm.
dehumanizing, but not dehumanizing in a way of putting me down, dehumanizing in a way of putting me up.
Where
And
you
I
have to make the decisions.
seek to balance it by, for instance, by engaging with hobbies in areas where nobody looks up to me. I'm a computer restorer. I work with it will be three. I work currently with two different museums, one in the
Oh,
Netherlands, one in Belgium. I restore
I
rare
love those computers. I
historical.
told you last time or whenever we talked about I love those computers, like retro looking. They're so
Oh,
cool.
I restore really rare stuff. On that table
So
behind
cool.
me now, there is a Sol 20,
Oh my god.
first home computer
I can
ever made.
completely that stuff just makes me crazy to think about.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that's very rare stuff lands here, because I take on certain restorations that most other restorers will not touch
Wow.
because it's too rare and they are afraid that he would, screw it up. Uh,
Yeah.
in that world of vintage computing, history, technology, nobody looks up to me, except that
It's
I
not
have
really a world of
reliable
looking up
hands.
to you.
Now, I'm a good restorer, so people come to me for that. And then after that, we all go for a beer and we make
Yeah.
jokes and we talk nonsense. And I can be crass and vulgar,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody will raise an eyebrow because Bernardo Kastrup just told a vulgar joke because I'm
Yeah.
just the bloody computer restorer.
Yeah.
So no, I
That's
have
the
doubts.
trick, is to be in different, not only dependent on this one little bubble world, where you are super famous or whatever. Did you never look up to people though? Have you never treated people like that? I
I
always,
do. I tend to do that
yeah.
with dead people. I look up to Jung.
Like
I look up to
Jung, for
Schopenhauer.
example,
Yeah,
Carl
Jung,
Jung.
Schopenhauer. With living people, it almost doesn't happen. Happens only a little bit. I have three living heroes, five living heroes in technology. I don't have a living hero in philosophy. And that tells you something about how I judge the state of philosophy in the early 21st century. I,
Mm.
I have people in philosophy that I'm thankful for their influence, like David Chalmers, who opened certain doors in my mind 25 years ago. I'm thankful to him. I think he's a very valuable philosopher, but I
Mhm.
don't put him on a pedestal. No, I don't do that. I
No.
only do that with dead philosophers. And
Yeah,
in the world
safe.
of technology,
Mhm.
I put
Schopenhauer.
five people in a pedestal. Yeah.
You're not gonna tell me one of your
Oh,
technological.
yeah. I put Martin van der Brink, who was
Oh,
my more or less distant mentor for 15 years. He used to be the CTO of ASML. He retired this year. I look up
wow.
to Federico
That's really
Fagin.
powerful that you worked for that place for so long and you still have such positive feelings. Pretty
Taught
legit.
me, yeah, Martin taught me to be viscerally and uncompromisingly honest. In other words, to not give up until you have looked under every stone of your own mental bullshit landscape.
Mm, that's wonderful. That sums up a lot of what's great about your work for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, he was difficult to work with because he could be
Mhm.
absolutely brutal,
Mm,
and some people just couldn't bear that.
mm.
But I got used to that, and I and
Brutal
I
because of truth, not coding it, not coding the
he
truth kind of
doesn't
thing, or brutal
code
with
it at
intention?
all. No,
Okay.
he no
But the
he
intention wasn't brutal, or was it?
no.
Just for
It
clarity,
was on
was it?
content, not on personality. It was
Yeah,
on
because that
content.
matters
Yeah, if you
with that
came to
word.
him with a story that was weak and full of holes, he would crucify your story.
That's so refreshing, though. I really trust that. I really like that when that's part of being famous too, right? That you want people to still do that because it's such a service
So
that you
if you're
can,
famous, people don't do that to you anymore. Yeah.
yeah, but that's what I
Martin did
mean. It's
because I was nobody.
a
I
problem.
was a kid of 31 years old when I started working with him. And then he was merciless. Martin is the antithesis of woke. Not that he's racist, it's not because he discriminates, he doesn't. But he doesn't care about the social coding. He doesn't sugarcoat anything.
Mm,
He is brutal in his commitment to
cool.
what is true. And that influenced my philosophy a lot because it made me brutal against physicalism, against materialism. Like I wouldn't sugarcoat why it's bullshit.
Mhm.
Set helped set the tone of how I speak philosophy.
Yeah, it says a lot about
Um,
you, but also that it's because those are heavy words, especially in the context of everything we've been talking about, and it's really important that those words are used, like, towards authenticity and honesty and these kind of intentions, not towards people or towards, like, what scares you or, like, it's interesting that because I do think that's part of the attraction, right, of the
well, it's
clarity that and also when reading your stuff, you can tell you've done all the work. Even talking to you about these issues, you're obviously quite hard not hard on yourself, but yeah, you don't seem to talk about stuff unless you've really looked at it as in a very deep way, which is refreshing.
yeah, it's perfectly normal in the way I experience life. You only talk about things you have looked at carefully, right? Otherwise, you're just spouting out sounds without meaning. But Martin was one of them. Another one is Federico Fagin, the inventor of the
Oh, yeah.
microprocessor and MOS silicon gate
He just
technology.
yeah, I think
He's a
I've
personal
been
friend.
in contact with him, yeah.
He has become a philosopher as well, an idealist philosopher.
He wrote a book recently about consciousness too, right? or yeah,
Several. Essential
several.
Foundation published one of them in English.
Okay.
Another one is Bill Mensch, one of the designers of the 6502 microprocessor in the 70s, who
Wow.
I also happen to know personally, to have the privilege of knowing personally. Sophia Wilson, the designer of the ARM instruction set, the processor that is now everywhere. Everything is an ARM processor now. Sophia
Oh,
Wilson designed that in the mid
oh,
1980s.
cool. I didn't know that.
I don't know her personally. I haven't had the privilege of meeting her personally, but she's a living hero of mine. And who designed the microelectronics of the ARM processor. I'm drawing a blank on his name now.
I wish I could help you,
Ferber.
but
Steve
Herbert.
Ferber. Yeah,
Oh,
so Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber were two in a box. They were designing the ARM, the first ARM microprocessor that came out in 1985, and it's now everywhere. It's the processor. Steve was doing the microarchitecture. Sophie was doing the instruction set architecture. So the two of them are living heroes of technology and certainly living heroes of mine.
it's a paradigm shift or something there with that. Do you
Yeah,
think?
look, they did what is what you can see in my philosophy. They looked for ways to make things simple. An
Mhm.
ARM processor is as good as it is because it's simple. It took away
Yeah,
complication, it took
yeah.
away clutter, and it
I
made
wish I understood it
things
better, but
simple.
that's what I was getting at is the paradigm shift that we need right now is how to getting to that where that's the because there's something so powerful and attractive about it, and it's not what we are seeing right now, but maybe even in all these other realms we've been talking about, that could be like, people could feel that, right? What you feel, what I feel a little bit, which I don't understand the technology well enough to feel it totally, but I know it's one reason I love those retro computers. I know that feeling of it being simple enough that you can understand how it works and still doing even better. And there's something about that could be very interesting if other people understood the power in that, which
Yeah,
maybe
it's
is
what
what
we are
you're.
trying to. It's not a secret in the sense that I'm not hiding it, but not many people know. I started an AI company this year with a group of friends, very clever people, and we are trying to create an AI processor, an AI chip. It's actually a sea of processors, an AI
Mm,
chip that will be so simple, so elegant, so optimized for AI that it will prevent what's happening today, which is AI data centers demanding enormous amounts of electrical power,
yeah.
enormous quantities of water for cooling,
Yeah, why does it have to
enormous
be like
price
that? I always
points.
wonder.
Yeah,
Okay.
it may cost to train a new large language model today. You're talking order of magnitude $10 billion. The next one maybe 100, unless you do
Good
something
lord.
about it. And the way to
Wow.
do something about it is to go back to
The
metal
basics.
level design,
Yeah.
because we are so used now to building on top of layers and layers of abstraction of things that are already designed and just adding more of that because it's faster to design that way. We lost contact with the metal level, with the bare level. No, starting
Mhm.
something from complete scratch. Nobody
Mhm.
designs that way anymore. And because of that, we have built up layers and layers of suboptimal solutions that we just want to reuse. And so what we are trying to do is much like what Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber did in the early 80s, which is take a step back. Let's
Hmm.
look at the problem anew and let's design something absolutely from scratch, from the level of an individual transistor, from the
Mm.
level of an individual copper line, a wire in a chip.
Oh, wow, that's
And
really exciting, Bernardo. I didn't know
yeah,
that's what your company was about. Wow.
so we want to prove that the way to go is simplicity, not clutter, not
Yeah.
sandbagging, not complication. We want to prove that we can do it so simple. And then if we succeed in that, I'll be in an excellent position to explain it to people and say, it is not
Mhm.
conscious. It is a simple mechanism. It creates the illusion of consciousness by giving you
Oh,
completely
wow.
understandable answers. But the meaning in it is the meaning you are projecting on it, and the meaning
Yes.
that the people who produce the training set, the texts, the thing that was trained on, the meaning that those writers embodied in the words. The thing in itself sees no meaning, experiences no meaning. It's just a natural language interface to searching human knowledge. But I'm years away from making that case. Right now, we have to prove that we can be a lot better than NVIDIA's GPUs, Google TPUs, and the NPUs of ARM and the rest. Once we prove that, then I'll be in a position to try to reach my real goal, which is not to become rich, because my life will not change anyway, but to enter.
It's okay to become rich, though. You can give money to other things.
Yeah, I can give money to Essential Foundation. Yeah, that would be nice. Guarantees.
Money is good if you give it. So
If you do it, it's very difficult to spend money responsibly. I count several very wealthy people as personal friends, and they all have their hearts in the right place. Their main
mm,
difficulty is how to spend money productively and responsibly. It's very difficult to do it. But I have
yeah,
Essential Foundation, and I will not be so rich that I'll get more money than I can use at Essential Foundation. So that's good. But I want to cement a very solid position for myself in the field of AI, because the whole discussion about philosophy and metaphysics, philosophy of mind, that discussion is going to go under the umbrella of AI, and for the first time in history, become a mainstream discussion, as opposed to an academic discussion, which is how it started in ancient Greece. Started in what would later become academic institutions, but they were the schools of the Greek. So for the
yeah,
first time in the 2,500 year of the history of philosophy in the West, in the Western tradition, philosophy of mind, what is reality, will become a mainstream topic as opposed to a topic for schools, for academia. So, although I am established as a philosopher of mind in academia, I happen to have a doctorate in computer engineering as well. I am in a good position to
yeah.
independently establish a strong foothold in raw AI. So, if I say something, people respect me not only because I'm a philosopher of mind, but because I build the AI stuff. I
Yeah.
helped build the chip.
It goes the other way around too. Maybe all this thinking simply and learning how to, because there's a process of learning how to clarify your thought process and simplify, and but also to do all this, take in everything in the way that you do. That's not an easy thing to learn, but I can imagine that would be helpful towards reimagining what a large language model could be, or what a chip could be, or if you could look at where you've gotten, you could maybe see different ways to get there. Maybe it
Yeah,
helps.
yeah, and my experience in the community of history of computing, I have in my mind the entire history of computers from Charles Babbage all the way to the first valve-based computer, the ENIAC, all the way into the home computers of the 80s and into today's GPUs and supercomputers. I've been in that world of semiconductors for 25 years. So
Oh, wow.
having a background in philosophy of mind and a background in the history of computer is indeed useful if you want to start a design from scratch without any
Yeah.
baggage, without reusing anything, with no sandbagging at all, just from scratch. And you build the edifice all the way up again with the knowledge of how these things were done before, right and wrong, how they improved. So you have all that historical knowledge and you can apply. So, yes, it's helpful. And psychologically, for me, and that goes back to the discussion we just had about my being a philosopher and not really being comfortable with becoming
Yeah.
known. It's a great excuse for me to spend my time in the obscurity of an electronics laboratory. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Keeps you
and
grounded.
yeah,
Kind of a
entertaining the desires I had as a kid. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a computer engineer. I'm feeding that. I'm nurturing that again. I'm not doing this alien thing, philosophy that was imposed on me at some point. And I can do that without feeling guilty because I know that by doing this, I will be contributing to my philosophical work
hmm,
because the philosophy
yeah.
discussion will become an AI discussion. So for me, it's a great scenario. I can indulge my true feelings, my true desires, and do it without guilt.
I can't connect the dots yet, but even if we do away with all the isms and we just look at where we are in terms of all the different things we've been talking about, it seems like we're trying to figure out, like, all this is connected. The way we're dealing with technology, the way technology is built, and our stance towards what consciousness and mentality are, and also all of this kind of what we get swept away by, which is very technologically based now, why we get swept away by it, and, like, how that all shifts. It does seem really connected because right now it seems like a mystery the way everything works in technology to people, such that we try to make it conscious, which is somehow obscuring the fact that it's changing our consciousness as a tool. There's some very it's hard for me to connect the dots exactly, but that paradigm shift I'm talking about that would raise us out of this ruts of dichotomy could come just with a simplicity that could be understood in those across those levels in a way that would just help people reorient um, towards how they understand what consciousness is and what meaning is and
Yeah,
what
we have
technology does
even,
to that.
I can't give you names yet, but we even have a well established neuroscientist in the group
Oh, great.
because he will be in a good position to say, I understand the brain. I understand this thing because I'm in this company as well. I understand how this thing was designed because we've designed it from the individual gate level up.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, we have no reason to think that it is conscious. We cannot refute that it might be conscious because we cannot refute the flying spaghetti monster either. There are very few things we can refute. What we can
Examples.
say is whether we have good reasons to entertain the possibility that this thing is conscious of itself or not. And we will be in a good position if we succeed to say that we have no reasons to think that what we've created, and hopefully it will be so good, everybody will use it, and we'll be able to say we've created it,
Yeah.
and it is a mechanism. It's a clever mechanism produced out of the aware intelligence of humans. It's a mechanism, a very nice, clever one, very efficient, and it will do all your LLMs, your AI tasks. It will help the world deal with the inverted demographic pyramid. Because if LLMs can replace humans, say in call centers, then those humans maybe can be retrained to be nurses. And you soften the impact of this unique new thing in the history of humanity, which is an inverted population pyramid. We may be just in time to do that because the critical point is the 2040s, 2050s. That's when the population bombs will explode around the world, not only in the West, but in Russia, mainly in China. They have the biggest problem in Brazil,
Mm.
in the global South. So we are also doing something good for the world. Of course, it creates problems of its own. You may lose your job to an AI. And that's why having thought about these issues carefully over the years, I am a supporter of unconditional basic income, universal basic income, because it's a net gain for humanity that we can automate certain tasks so we have more time to live the way we want, right?
Yeah.
It should be a net gain so long as the benefits are equally spread across the population and doesn't just go into the hands of a few shareholders that will maximize their profits by firing people and still charging the same amount of money for what they do, or governments that will continue to collect taxes and not give people a universal basic income. So if we get the social aspect well sorted, AI is a great net positive for humanity. It will spare us from menial tasks, will allow us to focus on what is important and to live our lives the way we want to live, in
I think
addition
that's
to
so
tackling
true.
the
Yeah.
philosophical
I
questions.
think it's happening. People think AI is a big revolution, and it is, but I don't think it is in the way we think. It's related to what's possible for us in terms of consciousness, and I think that would be a whole other discussion. I just realized we've been talking really a long time, like 3.5 hours,
Yes,
so
I
I
need
should let
to.
you go.
I have
Yeah.
a back problem that radiates to my arm.
Okay, let's go
My arm
then.
is really painful right now. I need
Oh,
to
no,
change
you
my
should have told
position.
me.
It's okay.
Bernardo, you should have told me. Thank you. Sorry.
No, don't. You
So
shouldn't feel guilty about it. We were talking about important topics.
okay. I still feel a little guilty. In any case, the point is, yeah, I think it has to do with how we experience consciousness too, and that might actually could become a different experience within itself. But I'll leave it at that. And is there anything you want to say before we go, other than that your arm hurts and I kept you too long?
No, you didn't keep me for too long. It was important to do this. No,
Okay.
I think we've covered everything we had originally planned to cover. So I'm a happy camper.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome. Thanks for having me and doing this.
I really appreciate you. Okay.
Have a good week. Have a good week going forward.